You are listening to the Tales of Conundrum podcast, Episode 13, Victim Blame Syndrome. Part 1, The Strange Turn. Larry Stone stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps, the horizon still painted in the subdued pinks and grays of early dawn. Normally, the city at this hour was an orchestra of blaring car horns, chattering pedestrians, and the tinny hum of street vendors setting up their carts. Yet this morning, the noise felt inexplicably muted, as though every distant sound had been gently pushed behind thick glass. In the hush, Larry could hear his own pulse thrumming in his ears. He paused for a moment, inhaling air that tasted vaguely of copper and electricity, like the atmosphere just before a thunderstorm. A ghostly wind skimmed along the empty sidewalks, carrying with it the faintest whistle, an almost melodic echo that caused the hairs on the back of his neck to rise. He'd been to this courthouse countless times. Typically, he would arrive energized, steeling himself for battle in the war against crime. As a seasoned prosecutor, Larry prided himself on an unwavering moral compass, a belief that he stood at the forefront of justice. But something about today felt different. The swirling hush settled on his skin like a low-grade fever, making him uncomfortably aware of every step he took. He glanced around. People were out and about, but they appeared subdued. Heads were bowed, voices hushed, eyes averted. Even the city's usual klaxons seemed distant, as if they'd been swallowed by the thick morning air. Larry took a moment to straighten the lapels of his suit. A pale sun struggled to break through the dense cloud cover overhead, washing the city in a flat, monochrome light. To his right, a shadow caught his attention, something tall and flickering. He turned to see a massive digital billboard perched at the corner of an adjacent building. Its swirling neon lights faded in and out, depicting a single phrase in bold, almost menacing letters. "Silence the aggrieved. Set them free." The words marched across the screen with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if daring passers-by to read them twice. He felt a chill roll up his spine. The slogan itself was jarring, but what truly rattled him was how no one seemed the least bit disturbed by it. Commuters trudged past that sign without giving it a second glance, distracted by their coffee cups or the restless flicker of their phones. A young man in a gray hoodie stood at the corner, smoking a cigarette, his eyes blankly skipping over the ominous display. A woman carrying a briefcase briskly walked by, her heels tapping an uneven staccato on the pavement, never once lifting her gaze. Larry wondered if he was the only one who found the message ominous. The billboard's letters were tall, unwavering, and bathed in a disquieting shade of electric blue that pulsated like a living heartbeat against a black background. The entire tableau exuded a sense of silent prophecy, as though warning him of some dark turn soon to come. Clenching his jaw, he started up the steps. He tried to refocus on the day's agenda. He had a major case in front of him, one that had consumed months of painstaking investigation. The defendant, Dan Scrubs, stood accused of crimes so heinous that even Larry, who had seen nearly every depravity the city could muster, had struggled to keep his composure while reviewing the evidence. DNA had been collected from multiple scenes. There were eyewitness testimonies that painted an unequivocal portrait of guilt. Video and audio recordings, albeit partially grainy, corroborated the worst of the allegations. On paper, this was the kind of case prosecutors dreamed of, airtight and damning. Yet, as Larry took another step, he noticed a group of passers-by whispering among themselves. He couldn't make out every word, but fragments floated in the still air. All that fuss just because... maybe they're exaggerating. Some people love to play victim. The words dripped with a casual dismissal that rattled him. He couldn't pinpoint exactly why it bothered him so much. The possibility that a sense of cynicism or fatigue had begun to infect the public mind wasn't new. Media coverage often turned savage, twisting facts, sowing doubt. But there was a sharp edge to these hushed remarks that felt new to Larry, as though the speakers believed that victims were the true burden on society, that laws existed only for those too weak to handle life's cruelties. His gut churned. This was the same city that had always rallied around the wronged, or so he'd believed. Now, not more than 30 yards from the courthouse's entrance, he was hearing murmurs that seemed to question whether the victims in this case were overreacting. He tried to shrug it off, reminding himself that cynics would always exist. But a knot in his stomach persisted. as if some primal instinct was warning him that a fundamental shift had occurred, a distortion in the moral architecture that once held the city together. The hush in the air only amplified this dread, making him feel both hyper-aware and strangely powerless. As he reached the top of the stairs, the imposing columns loomed overhead. The courthouse doors were still locked, as it was slightly earlier than usual, but there was already a line of people waiting to get in: defendants, lawyers, families of victims, and a handful of journalists with cameras slung over their shoulders. A few recognized Larry and offered polite nods, but the typical bravado or casual banter was absent. Even the press members, normally eager to pull him aside for a quick quote or soundbite, stood quietly, arms folded, eyes darting. One local reporter, a woman Larry remembered from a recent piece on city corruption, gave him a tight-lipped smile and quickly looked away, as though she'd thought better of approaching him. It was as if they were all waiting for something, an inevitable confrontation that none of them fully understood. Larry exhaled, trying to center himself. He needed a clear head. In a few short hours, he'd be standing in front of a judge and jury, presenting evidence that, by all logical accounts, should ensure Dan Scrubs was put away for a very long time. The city had been shaken by Scrubs's alleged actions, multiple incidents of assault, each one leaving behind a trail of undeniable forensics. The media coverage, at least initially, had been outraged on behalf of the victims. Yet as time wore on, interest had waned, replaced by more sensational headlines, politics, and scandal. There was still coverage, but it felt rote, lacking the moral indignation that once followed stories of this magnitude. Now, in the hush of the morning, Larry couldn't help feeling that the tide of public perception had somehow turned, or at least receded, leaving behind an apathy that tasted bitter on his tongue. He tried to banish the negativity. Focus on the facts, he told himself. DNA evidence, eyewitness accounts, audio recordings. There was no reason for the case to fail. The doubts he was picking up might just be routine pre-trial jitters. Every big case came with emotional currents swirling around it, especially if the media was involved. Perhaps he was reading too deeply into an offhand snippet of conversation, or letting that cryptic billboard message get under his skin. Still, that billboard, silence the aggrieved, set them free. Whose freedom did it advocate for? The offenders? The silence of the victims sounded like a clarion call for complicity. It made him shudder. He looked back at it one more time, noticing how the colors seemed to flash just a little more vividly against the dull gray sky. A sudden gust of wind tugged at his jacket, as if urging him forward. He sighed, turned on his heel, and stepped closer to the courthouse doors. A security officer inside recognized him through the glass and pressed a button to let him in. The lock clicked, the heavy doors swung open, and that hush seemed to deepen, as if the building itself was part of the same silent conspiracy. Inside the lobby, the chill was replaced by a sterile climate-controlled dryness. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, an incessant hum that felt even louder in contrast to the hush outside. Larry showed his ID to the security guards. They waved him through the metal detector out of habit more than necessity, exchanging routine pleasantries, but their voices were subdued, as though they too sensed a strange tension brewing. One guard, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, gave Larry a look that was a cross between sympathy and worry. He didn't say a word, but Larry felt a moment of camaraderie, an unspoken acknowledgement that something was off. He checked his watch. 7:15 a.m. The courthouse wouldn't officially open its doors to the public for another 15 minutes. He had time to head upstairs and finalize his notes. The building's corridors were nearly empty at this hour, the overhead lighting casting elongated shadows across the marble floors. His footsteps echoed, a lonely clack that seemed to reverberate far too loudly. Occasionally, he passed a stray staff member or an attorney reviewing paperwork by the benches. Each offered a polite nod, but conversation was minimal. Everyone seemed trapped in their own contemplations, as though disturbed by an intangible weight pressing down on the halls of justice. Reaching the second floor, Larry navigated to his usual staging area, a small conference room he had reserved to go over last-minute details. He dropped his briefcase on the table, loosened his tie, and sat down heavily in one of the worn leather chairs. Automatically, his mind began to inventory the evidence against Dan Scrubs: the police reports, the forensic analyses, the victim's statements, the chain of custody documents. On any other day, the clarity and volume of this evidence would fill him with confidence. Yet all he felt was a deep-seated unease. He recalled the first time he'd come across Dan Scrubbs's name, months ago, when scattered reports of violent assaults began to surface. It didn't take long for detectives to notice a pattern. Scrubbs left behind incriminating markers, careless mistakes, or perhaps brazen signatures of control. As the number of incidents rose, law enforcement closed in. After a lengthy investigation, they'd caught him. That moment had felt triumphant, but it had also churned up a swirl of public outcry. Larry remembered the early days of the coverage, the talk shows decrying the violence, the editorial pieces calling for a swift and merciless trial. But now, in the stillness of the courthouse, it felt like the anger had dissipated, replaced by… what, exactly? Complacency? Skepticism? There was a line between cynicism about the justice system and outright contempt for victims. Larry had never expected that line to be so thoroughly crossed. Leaning back in his chair, he ran a hand through his hair. He thought about the individuals who would fill the jury box soon. Typically, jurors took this civic duty seriously, forging a bond that transcended personal inconvenience. They often arrived with pens and notepads, prepared to listen and weigh the truth. Yet, that fleeting moment outside, where he'd caught the eye of a potential juror, the man had gazed back at him not with curiosity or respect, but with a strange sort of accusation. It was as if the man were silently demanding to know why Larry was so intent on pushing for guilt. Or was Larry simply projecting his own anxieties? He sighed and opened his briefcase. Methodically, he reviewed each piece of evidence, reminding himself that justice was built on facts, not on ephemeral mood shifts in the public. He read through a transcript of an eyewitness statement, then a summary of the DNA results. The data was incontrovertible. No rational jury could dismiss it, and no defense attorney, however crafty, could ignore the weight of such proof. If all went according to procedure, Dan Scrubbs would have no chance of wriggling free. Still, the morning's strange atmosphere refused to leave him. A creeping dread unfurled in his chest, winding around his heart. He needed to ground himself. Closing the file, he exhaled deeply and recited a mantra he'd always used on major trial days. The truth is on our side. Let the evidence speak. He pictured each of the victims he'd interviewed, the tremors in their voices, the tears in their eyes, their unshakable resolve to see justice done. That memory steadied him. This case wasn't just about him proving a point. It was about giving a voice to those who had suffered unspeakable harm. Time slipped by. The mechanical whir of the building's ventilation system was, at times, the only sound in the hallway. Outside the conference room, footsteps began to increase in frequency. Soon, people would be heading to the courtroom, the benches filling up with reporters, curious onlookers, and, of course, the potential jurors. Larry rose from his chair, straightened his tie, and packed up his files. Whatever bizarre tension was floating through the city, he had a job to do. Descending the hallway, he noticed more employees bustling about, clerks, a few junior attorneys, and a bailiff or two. A pair of interns trotted by, speaking in hushed voices about evidence catalogs. The bigger halls of the second floor led to wide windows that overlooked the street below. Larry caught a glimpse of the billboard once more, the bright electric blue letters still hammering out their unsettling mantra. Silence the aggrieved. Set them free. In the daylight that had now fully broken through, the sign looked even more out of place, a ghastly neon siren in an otherwise mundane cityscape. Cars drifted by in a near-silent procession, and the crowd outside had begun to swell in anticipation of the court's opening. A bailiff stepped out from a nearby office and offered him a curt nod. Larry forced himself to smile in return. The tension between them wasn't personal. Everyone just seemed on edge. As he moved past the bailiff, he heard the faintest snippet of conversation drift from down the hall. Something about making too big a deal out of it. The words ignited a flicker of annoyance deep within him. He didn't recognize the voice, but it carried the same sentiment he'd overheard earlier on the steps. That pressing charges or highlighting these crimes was somehow an overreaction. He half considered following the voice, maybe addressing whoever said it, but thought better of it. He had a trial to focus on. Confrontation in the hallway would serve no one. The main courtroom was in the older wing of the courthouse, a part of the building with high ceilings and archaic wood paneling that creaked whenever someone so much as shifted in a seat. The corridor just outside the courtroom was lined with tall, frosted windows. Streaks of sunlight tried to break through, creating a strange interplay of shifting shadows along the walls. The battered wooden benches were mostly empty now, but the press gallery had begun to set up. One camera crew was fussing over a tripod, while another quietly debated where to position a microphone. Their murmurs buzzed in the quiet. Even they seemed more reserved than usual, as if uncertain whether capturing the spectacle was appropriate or if something more ominous was looming behind the typical news cycle. As Larry approached, a young journalist recognized him. He was a fresh face, likely new to the courthouse beat, clutching a notepad. The journalist opened his mouth as if to ask a question, paused, then only managed a terse nod before turning away. Larry found himself strangely relieved not to have to dish out a soundbite. He wasn't certain what he would say. Yes, I'm prepared. Yes, the evidence is solid. Yes, the city still believes in justice. Doesn't it? The weight of that unspoken question pressed down on him. Glancing over his shoulder, he saw movement at the far end of the corridor. A small group of potential jurors had arrived, men and women from various walks of life, some in suits, some in casual attire. They were waiting to be ushered into the courtroom for voir dire, the selection process that would decide who would hear Dan Scrubbs's case. As he watched them, he felt an involuntary twinge of apprehension. Any one of these people could end up on the jury that decided Scrubbs's fate, not to mention the fate of those who had bravely come forward with their stories. Then, in the midst of that cluster, he spotted the man from the steps outside. He was tall, probably in his early 40s, with sharply parted hair and a thin, pinched expression. Their eyes met, and for an instant, Larry swore he sensed hostility radiating across the polished floor. It was the same look he'd gotten earlier, the look of someone who regarded him as an intruder or a meddler, not a bringer of justice. Larry's chest tightened. He forced himself to maintain a neutral expression, giving a courteous nod. The man's lips pressed into a line. Without returning the nod, he looked away, busying himself with smoothing the lapel of his jacket. In that moment, the hush that had persisted all morning seemed to roar in Larry's ears. It was as though the rest of the corridor, the building, the entire city, had faded, leaving only him and the silent judgment emanating from that single potential juror. It was absurd, of course. He had no way of knowing what the man thought. Possibly he just disliked lawyers or found the entire process a waste of time. Still, the moment left a sour aftertaste, reinforcing the insidious notion that support for victims and the pursuit of truth was faltering. He cleared his throat and forced himself to continue. A bailiff stepped forward to unlock the heavy wooden doors that led into the main courtroom. The slow grind of the door's antique hinges reverberated in the stillness, echoing as if down a long tunnel. A few early spectators drifted into the gallery seats. The emptiness of the room amplified their footsteps. Rows of worn, polished benches stood like soldiers waiting for an audience of quiet watchers, the judge's bench rising at the front like a carved throne. Bright overhead lights hummed, reflecting off the smooth surface of counsel tables. Larry took a seat at the prosecutor's table, placing his briefcase beside him. The notes he needed for the opening of voir dire were neatly tucked away in a folder, but he didn't reach for them yet. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on the table, trying to steady his nerves. The hush followed him even here, descending like a heavy cloak across the large, still empty room. Sometimes, in high-profile cases, the hush existed because of the sheer gravity of the crimes in question, a kind of solemn respect for the victims. But today, it felt different. The hush was laced with doubt and a certain intangible dread, an almost spiritual sense that the scales of justice might not balance as cleanly as one would hope. Clerks started bustling in. A couple of them offered Larry thin smiles. More potential jurors trickled inside, forming an orderly line near the back as they waited for instructions. The defense attorney, a man named Carlson with a slick confidence, arrived and sat up at his own table. He caught Larry's eye and gave him a nod that was disturbingly akin to pity, as though he foresaw a trial that wouldn't proceed the way Larry believed. Not a word was exchanged, but Larry felt his blood pulse a little faster in response. Through the open doors at the rear of the courtroom, the flickering lights of the hallway made themselves known. Larry couldn't help but steal one last look, half expecting to see the billboard's haunting message appear even within these hallowed walls. Silence the aggrieved. Set them free. Of course, it was just a mental phantom. Nevertheless, his mind clung to it, a persistent dread urging him to question just how far this sentiment might have spread. For a split second, he contemplated going outside again, maybe to check if the sign was truly there or if he'd misread the words in some haze of anxiety. But he knew he hadn't misread anything. The letters had been bold, and their meaning was all too clear, that there was a push, somewhere out there, to stifle victims' voices. Was this a new campaign? A twisted marketing ploy? A call for apathy disguised as liberation? He couldn't be sure. What he did know was that it seemed to align disturbingly well with the whispered cynicism he'd heard that morning, the looks people had given him, the shrugs of disinterest he felt in the very air. A court clerk came by, tapping him lightly on the shoulder. "Mr. Stone, we'll be ready to begin shortly," she said, her voice low yet polite. He nodded his thanks, returning her polite smile. His heart hammered. There was no time to dwell further on the billboard or the queasy feeling that had enveloped him since he set foot on the courthouse steps. He had a job to do, and the path to justice began now. The hush, however, refused to leave. It settled around him like a silent fog, an almost tangible presence that crawled into every corner of the courtroom. Sitting up straight, Larry slid his notes out of the briefcase and prepared himself mentally. The turning of key events was now in motion, but he couldn't shake the sense that he was stepping into a storm he didn't fully understand. As the clock ticked closer to the official start, he closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and told himself again, "We have the facts. The truth is on our side." Yet the hush around him seemed to whisper back, "But will anyone listen?" He opened his eyes, letting his gaze sweep the room. At the rear, the tall, wiry man, the potential juror who had glared at him outside, was still there, looking increasingly impatient. Their eyes met one final time before the man turned away, his expression as unreadable as a locked door. For a heartbeat, Larry felt as though he were the one being judged, the entire weight of the city's skepticism bearing down on him. Determined to push that sensation aside, he squared his shoulders, bracing himself for the battle ahead. And with that, the first gavel strike was imminent. Though the hush still lingered, soon the rustling of papers and the voices of judges, lawyers, and prospective jurors would fill the air. But nothing about that noise would dispel the undercurrent of dread Larry sensed. The echoes of that billboard message clung to him like a prophecy, and he couldn't help but wonder if, in the days to come, he'd be forced to confront not just a criminal named Dan Scrubs, but an entire atmosphere of doubt that had somehow managed to corrupt the very idea of justice. Part 2. Dark Shadows in Court. Larry Stone stood at the prosecution's table, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing like a nest of hornets. The hum was incessant, and he couldn't help noticing how it cast elongated shadows across the wood-paneled walls, turning the courtroom into a claustrophobic stage. Long strips of dull white illumination stretched over the defense table and juror's box, forming a grid of harsh lines that cut into every face, exposing tension and fear. A pang of anxiety settled in Larry's stomach as he flipped through the files in front of him, stacks of photographs, written statements, and forensic results detailing Dan Scrubs' alleged crimes. Ordinarily, such a trove of evidence would embolden him. Today, however, a subtle disquiet prickled at the back of his mind, warning him that something was amiss. The bailiff announced the judge's entrance, and everyone rose. The shuffle of feet against the tile floor momentarily cut through the buzzing lights, reminding Larry of insects skittering in a confined space. Judge Rutledge, robed in black, stepped onto the dais. He moved with measured calm, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes that Larry hadn't witnessed before. One might have missed it, a mere stutter in the judge's otherwise controlled demeanor, but Larry was adept at reading micro-expressions. For a second, Rutledge's lips tightened, as though he, too, sensed a sourness in the room. When the judge signaled for everyone to sit, Larry glanced at the jury box. 12 individuals, each carefully selected over the course of voir dire, gazed back at him. Some looked attentive, pens poised above notepads. Others wore expressions of mild detachment, eyelids drooping under the fluorescent glare. One or two seemed vaguely uneasy, tapping feet or crossing and uncrossing arms. Larry spotted the tall, wiry man who had caught his eye before, sitting with a rigid posture in the second row. Their gazes locked for a moment, and the man's face betrayed no sympathy, just a faint, inscrutable tension. Clearing his throat, Larry rose. He could almost taste the stale air around him. The ventilation was working, but the environment felt suffocating nonetheless. As a veteran prosecutor, he delivered opening statements countless times. Yet the hush that settled over the benches pressed on him like a physical weight. He reminded himself of the strength of the evidence. Graphic audio clips capturing Dan Scrubbs's voice, solid DNA matches tying him to the scenes, multiple witnesses who had come forward despite personal risk and trauma. All of it was there, meticulously filed and indexed. If there were ever a case that should inspire collective outrage, this was it. The hush deepened as Larry spoke. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, steadying his voice. "We are here today because the defendant, Dan Scrubbs, stands accused of a series of violent acts that have caused irreparable harm." He moved slowly, letting each word fall into the silence. Typically, he would see small nods of acknowledgement from a few jurors, or at least an empathetic shift when he mentioned the victim's plight. This time, however, the reaction was muted. Stony faces absorbed the information with an odd neutrality. He could sense a barrier forming between his words and the emotional resonance he expected them to ignite. Undeterred, he laid out the core of the case. "We have DNA evidence that places Mr. Scrubbs at multiple crime scenes. We have recorded audio in which a voice, verified through forensic analysis, admits to acts that match the charges against him. We have witnesses ready to testify under oath, describing what they saw and heard. The prosecution will prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Mr. Scrubbs is responsible for these crimes." Each sentence sounded crisp, almost rehearsed, but that was the nature of thorough preparation. Larry's voice echoed through the surprisingly quiet courtroom. On the other side, the defense attorney, Richard Carlson, jotted a note, his face a mask of calm. The flicker of the fluorescent lights caught the lines on Carlson's forehead, revealing nothing but the measured poise of a man ready to pounce as soon as it was his turn. Larry continued, "You'll hear directly from forensic experts who've tested the evidence multiple times, DNA samples that come back with a match so high, the likelihood of it belonging to anyone else is statistically negligible. You'll also hear the victims' accounts. Some of them can identify Dan Scrubbs by sight, by voice, even by his mannerisms." A few heads turned as he mentioned the word victims. There was a collective intake of breath, followed by an almost imperceptible sigh, as if the jury was already fatigued by the thought of hearing distressing testimony. Half an hour later, Larry concluded his statement, feeling a peculiar emptiness settle in the pit of his stomach. He expected the gravity of the allegations to weigh on the jurors, to spur at least a few flashes of anger or concern. But the silence that followed was cold, tinged with something that bordered on indifference. Once he returned to his seat, Carlson stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate leisure. Carlson's voice resonated softly, like a snake's hiss traveling through tall grass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are not here to dispute facts that may or may not be relevant to my client's innocence. Indeed, there is a great deal of evidence, but it is not my job to concede that evidence is automatically correct or contextually fair. Rather, I ask you to consider something deeper. Are we using this courtroom to air petty grievances? Are we overestimating harm for the sake of sensational headlines or personal vendettas?" Larry felt a stab of indignation. Petty grievances? The phrase was so dismissive it nearly caused him to stand and object, but he caught himself. Carlson was cagey. He was testing the waters, trying to plant seeds of doubt. The cunning approach was palpable in the confident way he walked around the defense table, letting the words marinate in the jury's consciousness. Carlson continued, "You'll hear stories, some of which may be dramatic, yes. But drama does not equate to truth. We must ask whether the system is being used to punish a man beyond what's proportionate. We must question whether the so-called victims are, in fact, as deeply harmed as they claim. People sometimes blow incidents out of proportion." He paused, making a show of scanning the jury, as if searching for signs of agreement. "Your role, as the finders of fact, is to determine whether the prosecution's depiction of these events is accurate or exaggerated. A faint murmur rippled through the jury box. Larry couldn't tell if it was approval or apprehension. He darted a glance at the tall, wiry juror. The man had his arms crossed, and a slight frown tugged at his brow. It was unclear which side the man was leaning toward. The expression was somewhere between skepticism and annoyance. The judge leaned forward at this point. "Mr. Carlson," he said in a careful tone, "please keep your remarks focused on the evidence rather than on broad philosophizing about the system." The caution in the judge's voice was clear. Yet, Larry sensed that caution extended to the entire case. It wasn't the usual firm reprimand one might give a grandstanding attorney. Judge Rutledge was measured, as though concerned that coming down too hard might be misconstrued. This attitude only fueled Larry's unease. When had the bench begun to fear the repercussions of holding the line? Carlson finished his statement shortly thereafter, concluding with a polite smile. The trial's opening had set the stage for what was certain to be a heated battle, except the heat felt strangely one-sided. Larry felt a creeping chill instead, as though a draft had slithered through the vents, wrapping itself around the jury and the bench, taming their reactions. Once formalities were complete, Larry began presenting the evidence in earnest. He moved to the digital display area, hooking up a small audio device. The hush in the courtroom thickened as he played a short clip of a recorded voice. The static crackle of the recording filled the space, followed by a rough male timbre. Though the words were partially obscured, the meaning was stark. Admissions of wrongdoing that matched the timeline of the assaults. Larry had carefully edited the clip to exclude the more graphic statements, but it was still jarring. He paused the playback and looked at the jury, expecting to see shock or at least concern. Some of them showed flickers of discomfort, while others glanced around as though uncertain how to react. Carlson sat unmoving, his hands folded, eyes gently closed as if this were a lullaby. "As you can hear," Larry said, his voice echoing in the microphone, "the individual on this recording references specific elements consistent with the crimes in question. We have voice analysis experts who will testify that this recording, to a high degree of certainty, is Dan Scrubbs's voice." He pivoted to the next piece of evidence, a forensic chart displaying the match probability of DNA samples taken from each crime scene. The science was unambiguous, thick lines of data that spelled out guilt in black and white. The numbers should have hit the jury like a gavel, 1 in billions, not mere millions, that the DNA could belong to anyone else. Yet as he detailed each segment of the chart, that intangible sense of doubt hung in the air. He heard a low cough from the gallery, then a brief shuffle as the tall, wiry juror shifted in his seat. Another juror, a woman in her 50s, scribbled notes without lifting her head. A third juror stared blankly, eyes glazed. The tension was palpable. It was as if they all recognized how damning the evidence was, yet no one wanted to be the first to condemn Dan Scrubbs outright. Eventually, Larry called his first witness, a forensic analyst who had processed the DNA swabs. She testified calmly, explaining the significance of the results, the thoroughness of the protocols used in the lab, and the minuscule margin for error. Despite the clarity of her testimony, certain jurors seemed restless. One tapped a pen repeatedly on the rail. Another glanced at his watch. As the witness described the specific markers that matched Dan Scrubbs's genetic profile, the tension in the air didn't dissipate. Instead, it evolved into an unsettling vibe of impatience, as though some in the jury were already thinking, "We know all this. Why drag it out?" When Larry finished his direct examination, Carlson rose for cross. The defense attorney's footsteps clicked over the linoleum as he approached the stand. His eyes were cool, fixed on the forensic analyst. "Thank you for your thorough explanation," he said, voice dripping with courtesy. "I'd like to ask a few clarifying questions, not to challenge your expertise but to ensure no stone is left unturned." He paused, letting the moment stretch. "Is it not true that errors can happen in any lab process, however unlikely?" The witness nodded carefully. "Human or mechanical errors are always possible, but we follow strict protocols." Carlson raised a hand gently. "Understood, but possible nonetheless." "Yes," she conceded, "though highly improbable." Carlson smiled. "And is it also possible that a partial match, under certain circumstances, might implicate the wrong individual if the sample is degraded or cross-contaminated?" The analyst hesitated. In theory, but in theory, Carlson cut in. Meaning we can't rule out that something in the chain of evidence went awry? An uneasy silence blanketed the courtroom. The witness tried to clarify, but Carlson's tactic was evident, sowing the smallest seeds of doubt. For all the robust science, he nudged the jury to dwell on the 1 in a million chance that the labs had made a mistake. It was a standard defense angle, one that Larry had anticipated. But the atmosphere made it feel disproportionately effective. It was as though the jury was primed to question everything, especially if it sided with the idea that the system was punishing someone unfairly. Once the analyst finished testifying, court recessed for lunch. Larry collected his files in silence, mulling over the odd vibe in the room. The evidence was strong, but the reaction from the jury and even the judge seemed distant, reluctant to engage with the sheer gravity of the facts. As he stepped into the hallway, he felt an odd tension in the air. Bystanders whispered in small clusters, avoiding direct eye contact with him. He walked toward the exit, intending to grab a quick sandwich at a nearby cafe. Just outside the courtroom, a mounted television displayed a local news broadcast. The anchor's voice was muted, but the scrolling chyron was impossible to miss. Should victims just move on? The text crawled across the bottom of the screen, accompanied by a freeze-frame image of a different case, a young woman who had recently pressed charges for assault. The half-second footage they showed of her was unflattering, capturing her blinking under harsh camera lights. Then the broadcast switched to a still photo of a protest sign, words too small to read. Even without audio, the question itself rang like a klaxon in Larry's mind. Should victims just move on? He grimaced, the exact phrase scraping across his nerves. In his years as a prosecutor, he'd witnessed sensational headlines, but never one so brazenly dismissive. If the media was championing the idea that victims shouldn't pursue justice, it explained the eerie shift he'd observed in the courthouse. Perhaps people were growing weary of high-profile cases, turning the blame toward those who spoke out rather than those who inflicted harm. The corridor felt narrower, the overhead lights glaring. He stepped away from the screen, refusing to linger. The short break was half over, and he still needed to prepare for the next phase of the trial. Witness testimonies detailing Dan Scrubbs's actions. Ordinarily, a break in the day brought a moment to recalibrate, but now it felt more like crossing the eye of a storm. Brief calm before another onslaught of twisted rhetoric. Every step he took felt heavier, as though the hush that had plagued him earlier had grown into an oppressive force. Back in the lobby, he spotted one of the witnesses waiting near a potted plant, eyes red from crying or lack of sleep. She was young, tense, arms wrapped around herself. The sight jolted Larry's sense of duty. He approached her gently, mindful that too much conversation in the open could be misconstrued. He spoke in a low, empathetic tone. "Don't worry. Just tell the truth. The facts are on our side." She nodded mechanically, lips quivering. I heard people talking. They were saying if I'd been stronger or more careful, maybe I wouldn't have ended up here." Tears threatened to surface, but she blinked them back. Larry suppressed a surge of anger. He touched her shoulder lightly. "You're doing the right thing. Don't let anyone undermine that." The witness exhaled shakily. "I hope the jury sees it that way." Those words tugged at his gut. He wished he could answer with unwavering confidence, but the room's earlier response, an unsettling swirl of apathy and doubt, haunted him. With a final reassurance, he left the witness to gather her composure. Time was running out. They needed to return to the courtroom soon. As he walked away, he noticed a group of people from the gallery quietly eyeing them. Their expressions were unreadable. Some might have been supportive, but the darkness under the fluorescent lights made it impossible to tell. He re-entered the courtroom, the same press of artificial brightness waiting for him. Up near the bench, the judge conferred with the clerk about scheduling. The defense attorney, Carlson, shuffled a stack of papers, occasionally glancing at the spectators. The bailiff nodded at Larry as he approached his table. Larry took his seat, scanning the jury box. Most jurors had yet to return from lunch, but a few drifted in early, wearing guarded expressions. He noted a distinct lack of small talk or casual camaraderie among them. They trickled in, silent, each finding a place in the box, reminiscent of puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit together. When the proceedings resumed, Larry called his next witness, a medical professional who had examined the victims. She described injuries consistent with the alleged crimes, emphasizing the emotional toll. The temperature in the courtroom might as well have dropped 10 degrees. The details of trauma, once guaranteed to awaken empathy, seemed to cast a pall of quiet restlessness. Murmurs rippled through the gallery seats, and Larry couldn't shake the impression that the question wasn't, "How could Dan Scrubs do this?" but rather, "Why are we hearing about this in such detail?" Carlson's cross-examination further galvanized that uneasy question. "Isn't it true," he asked the doctor, "that emotional distress can be mitigated by therapy, by a support system, by personal resilience? Not everyone suffers the same degree of trauma under similar circumstances, correct?" The witness frowned. "Trauma responses vary, but these injuries, both physical and mental, are severe enough that they require attention and—" "Of course," Carlson interrupted, "and we want individuals to heal. But is it necessary to drag my client through a lengthy trial if, with the right help, these victims could potentially move on with their lives quicker?" He made a sweeping gesture, as though pointing to an entire world of therapy clinics and counseling sessions beyond the courtroom walls. A hot flush roiled Larry's insides. He shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The counsel is implying these victims should not seek justice because therapy exists? That's irrelevant and prejudicial." Judge Rutledge hesitated. "Sustained," he said, voice measured. "Mr. Carlson, keep your questions to the medical facts, not policy on victim recovery." Carlson raised his hands in a show of contrition. "Of course, Your Honor. I was simply clarifying that suffering is subjective. What one person endures, another might overcome more easily." His lips twitched into a half-smile. "I'll move on." The damage, however, was done. The notion that victims might be coddled by the system hovered in the room like smoke, weaving into the fabric of the trial. Larry tried to maintain his composure, but he sensed the jury grappling with conflicting emotions. It was as if they were simultaneously told to acknowledge the seriousness of the crimes, yet also consider the idea that maybe these victims were being indulgent in their pursuit of legal remedies. The day wore on with more evidence. Larry presented video footage, albeit grainy, that showed a figure resembling Dan Scrubs in suspicious proximity to the crime scenes. Expert testimony identified key identifying features. Each new piece of evidence should have built a fortress of certainty, but each time, Carlson's measured challenges chipped away at the emotional impact. The defense attorney never outright denied the facts. Rather, he corralled them into a narrative of exaggeration, questioning whether the victim testimonies had been colored by public uproar or personal vendettas. As the hours piled up, the atmosphere of the courtroom grew thicker. Spectators in the gallery shifted in their seats, exchanging hushed commentary. Some might have been outraged at Carlson's strategy, yet Larry could not see outright condemnation on their faces. On the contrary, some expressions betrayed curiosity, or even agreement, with the notion that the system was possibly overreacting. Finally, in the late afternoon, the judge called for a recess. Court would reconvene the next day. Tension lingered as people filed out. The hum of conversation in the hallway was subdued, overshadowed by the flicker of overhead lights and the faint hiss of climate control vents. Larry watched the jury depart, eyes scanning their postures for any clue to their internal deliberations. Most appeared drained, as though the day's testimony had been a slog rather than a clarion call for justice. Gathering his documents, Larry made his way out. In the corridor, a couple of reporters approached with microphones, presumably fishing for a statement about the day's proceedings. But before they could corner him, he spotted another television, likely the same local station from earlier, cycling through headlines. He couldn't hear the anchor's voice, but the new chyron read, "Harsh justice or necessary evil," above a shot of the courthouse steps. The phrasing implied that punishing offenders might be more trouble than it was worth. Larry felt his jaw tighten. So this narrative wasn't just swirling around the city. It was being fed into households across the region. He made for the building's exit, stepping through the throng of attorneys, jurors, and curious onlookers. The hush he'd noticed that morning had morphed into a tense murmur, filling the corridors with subdued chatter that seemed less about seeking truth and more about entertaining the question of whether the trial was even necessary. An uneasy sense of foreboding gnawed at him. This is bigger than my courtroom, he thought. If the media's framing was turning victims into inconveniences, then even the strongest evidence might not be enough to sway public opinion. Outside, the late afternoon sun bathed the courthouse steps in a wash of amber light. People clustered at the bottom, some holding half-hearted signs. One read, "Enough trials already." Another said, "People lie," scrawled in bright red paint. The group wasn't large, but their presence told Larry that the trial had become a lightning rod for deeper societal discord. A swirl of exasperation and fear took root in his chest. He paused, scanning the scene. Then he noticed one of the jurors hurrying away from the building, jacket thrown over an arm, phone pressed to the ear. It was the tall, wiry man. He glanced back at Larry for a split second, as if aware he was being watched, then turned sharply on his heel and disappeared into the crowd. The moment seemed to underscore the entire day, an undercurrent of suspicion and a collective drift away from any sense of moral clarity. Larry inhaled sharply and made his way down the steps, cutting through the clusters of protesters and reporters. He didn't stop to answer questions, nor did he engage with the people holding signs. The day had been brutal, and his mind reeled with strategies for tomorrow. He would be calling eyewitnesses next, individuals who had personally seen Dan Scruggs commit acts that should have eradicated all doubt. Should being the operative word, because in the current climate, nothing felt certain anymore. Once he reached the street, he thought about the local news coverage he had just glimpsed. Should victims just move on? That question hovered like a specter in his thoughts. He wondered if, by the trial's end, the public would have accepted the defense's narrative so thoroughly that the evidence wouldn't matter. It was as if the entire city was quietly asking, "Why are we even putting this man on trial?" The voice of rational justice had been reduced to a whisper beneath the clamor of cynicism. A swirl of wind caught his jacket lapels, bringing with it the distant roar of traffic. The standard bustle of the city was out there, continuing, indifferent to the drama unfolding within the courthouse. For a moment, he felt an urge to shout, to rail against the apathy that had somehow replaced righteous anger. But he stifled it. Tomorrow, in court, he'd continue presenting the facts. He'd question witnesses, confront the defense's insinuations, and reaffirm that the victim's testimony wasn't just noise. They were people whose lives had been shattered, deserving of justice. Yet as he walked away, the image of that news chyron glowed in his mind's eye, an ominous sign of what he was truly up against. It was more than Carlson's cross-examinations or a mildly cautious judge. This was an entire cultural sea change, an undercurrent that threatened to carry the entire concept of justice into murky waters where victims were told to stay silent or move on. The shadows lingering in the courtroom weren't just about one man's guilt. They pointed to a broader, unsettling shift in how society viewed accountability and empathy. The last rays of daylight clung to the city's skyline, painting the courthouse behind him in a deep orange glow. Larry felt that glow on his back, a fleeting warmth that offered little comfort. He checked his watch. He had just enough time to return to his office, review the next day's testimonies, and perhaps salvage some measure of optimism before morning. But the heaviness in his heart told him that the real battle was no longer confined to legal briefs and evidence binders. A deeper darkness was spreading, a cloud of suspicion and detachment that threatened to overshadow even the most damning facts. And so, with each step he took away from the courthouse, Larry understood that what happened inside those walls was only a part of the struggle. The other part lay in contending with a world that might be growing indifferent to the very idea of seeking justice for those who had been harmed. A final gust of wind rustled the trees lining the street, and as he crossed onto the sidewalk, the buzz of the day's tension settled into his bones. Tomorrow, the trial would continue, but the question left spinning in his mind was whether truth and evidence could truly sway a jury, and a public that seemed increasingly unsure it wanted to hear them at all. Part 3. The Divided Faith. Larry Stone arrived at the church before dawn had fully broken across the sky. He had hoped the early morning hush would soothe his troubled mind, perhaps by letting him dwell in quiet meditation in a place that had once brought him peace. As he slipped in through the heavy oak doors, a faint smell of incense and old candles enveloped him like a well-worn blanket. But though the sanctuary's familiar scents and solemn shadows initially comforted him, an unsettling aura soon gnawed at that sense of safety. Even in the gentle half-light, the nave felt tense, as though the building itself strained under a burdensome secret. He made his way down the center aisle, passing rows of polished wooden pews. Stained glass windows climbed the walls in dramatic columns of color, their depictions of biblical scenes partially obscured by the dimness. Larry found a seat near the front, directly below a tall window of painted blues and violets that depicted a serene Christ figure blessing a multitude. Usually, he would look upon that figure and sense hope, a warm reassurance that compassion reigned over judgment. But today, those painted eyes seemed distant, almost searching. A quiet prickle traveled down his spine, as though even this depiction of the divine wondered how the world had drifted so far from its moral anchor. A handful of congregants trickled into the sanctuary, whispering among themselves. Their voices fluttered around the still air, but never rose above soft murmurs. Larry recognized many faces, neighbors, old friends, pillars of the community, and typically, they would greet him with friendly nods and quick smiles. But on this morning, few even made eye contact. One woman clutched her hymnal tightly to her chest, turning her face away when Larry tried to meet her gaze. Another man, who had once served on the church council with Larry, hurried past without a word, as though conversation were an inconvenience to be avoided. Larry tried to shrug off the slight. Perhaps people were simply lost in thought. Yet he couldn't deny a creeping apprehension. The stillness that pressed on the nave felt different from the usual reverential quiet of a church. Something else lurked here, a tension so pervasive that even the gentle play of morning sunlight through stained glass did little to dispel it. The flickering candles near the altar cast elongated shadows across the polished floor, distorting the shape of the cross that loomed behind the pulpit. Larry watched that dancing silhouette and felt an inexplicable pang of dread. By the time the service was about to begin, Pastor Rob Stevens emerged from a side door, clad in a simple black robe, his Bible held close. Under other circumstances, his presence might have calmed Larry. Rob had been a good friend, a mentor, someone who offered wise counsel in times of confusion. But today, the pastor's steps were heavy, his mouth set in a thin line. He approached the front of the sanctuary with measured pacing, ascended the stairs to the pulpit, and placed his Bible on the wooden stand with a decisive thud that echoed in the hush. The music director struck the first chord on the organ. A short processional hymn filled the church with solemn notes. Larry rose with everyone else, but his heart wasn't in the singing. He caught a glimpse of Pastor Rob's face and saw no trace of the gentle warmth that he used to associate with this man, only a guarded seriousness that hinted at some inner turmoil. With each verse, Larry's unease deepened, mingling with the rising melody to create a dissonant chord within him. When the hymn ended, the congregation sat, and Pastor Rob leaned into the microphone. "Good morning," he began, his voice resonating through the sanctuary. The system's slight feedback hissed before fading into silence again. "Today, I want to talk about forgiveness. True, unvarnished forgiveness. The kind of forgiveness Christ spoke about in the scriptures when he said, 'Turn the other cheek.'" Rob paused, his gaze traveling slowly across the pews. It's a lesson we so often overlook, focusing instead on retribution or fairness. But the Bible calls us to something higher, a holy mercy that transcends earthly justice. Larry felt the knot in his stomach tighten. He'd heard sermons on forgiveness before, countless times in fact, but never in such a tense atmosphere, never with so many eyes unwaveringly fixed on the pastor, as if they were hungry for a radical message. Larry glanced at the stained glass window overhead, the purples and blues swirling into a mosaic of light around him. The glass had always been a beacon of serenity, yet today, it seemed to filter the sunlight into an eerie glow that made Pastor Rob's words carry an otherworldly weight. Pastor Rob pressed on. "In our modern world, we've become accustomed to accusing, to pointing fingers, to demanding punishment for every slight and every wrongdoing. Our courts are full, our jails overcrowded, our hearts hardened. But Christ tells us to forgive, 70 times 7. He tells us that if someone strikes us, we are to offer them the other cheek. He tells us that if someone steals our shirt, we should offer our coat as well." A low murmur rippled through the pews. Some congregants nodded vigorously, as if they had been waiting all their lives to hear precisely these words. Larry's pulse quickened. He recognized the scripture references, but the way Pastor Rob delivered them seemed too absolute. It felt as if the nuance of compassion and accountability had vanished. replaced by an ironclad directive that all wrongs were to be endured in silence. Surely, Larry thought, there must be a line between personal forgiveness and the need to protect society from harmful acts. Yet as he scanned the rows, he saw faces bathed in an unsettling fervor, expressions of rapture, not doubt. His eyes drifted to the far side of the sanctuary, where two elderly women whispered to each other. He caught fragments of their conversation. "Yes, we shouldn't be dragging people to court," one said, shaking her head. "Let God handle them," replied the other. Larry closed his eyes, feeling a stab of bewilderment. Was the congregation truly turning its back on the idea that wrongdoers should be held accountable? He tried to steady his breathing, but his heart thumped erratically, as if warning him that this sermon was only the tip of an iceberg. Pastor Rob lifted his hands, and the hush deepened to an almost menacing silence. "It is not our place to judge," he declared, voice resonating off the high rafters. "Human judgment is flawed. We see only the surface, not the heart. When we accuse a fellow human being, we risk condemning them without understanding God's greater plan. And in doing so, we tarnish our own souls. By seeking earthly justice, we may forfeit a higher wisdom." Larry swallowed hard. The notion that pursuing justice in a court of law might actually damage one's soul was a twisting of doctrine he'd never heard from Pastor Rob before. The pastor had always been an advocate for mercy, yes, but also for truth and accountability. This new stance was absolute and frightening. It had the ring of fanaticism. Larry's thoughts raced. Could it be that the entire congregation was buying into this? People often turn to the church for comfort in times of moral uncertainty, but the language he heard now seemed designed to stifle any call for accountability. Quiet tears glistened in one young woman's eyes as Pastor Rob continued. "I know many of you carry burdens, pain inflicted by others, possibly acts you feel should be punished. But I urge you, reflect on Christ's command." He didn't say, "Pursue every offense in the courts." He said, "Forgive, and you shall be forgiven." The world scoffs at such radical grace, yet we must embrace it if we truly claim to follow the Prince of Peace. A chorus of amens echoed. Larry fought the urge to bolt from the pew. He felt as though the entire structure of right and wrong was warping before his eyes. He kept telling himself, maybe I'm misunderstanding. Maybe the pastor is just emphasizing the spiritual dimension of forgiveness. But the whispering, the rapt faces, and the subdued lighting all conspired to convey a darker message, an implicit condemnation of anyone who sought to hold wrongdoers accountable. He dared a glance at the cross suspended behind Pastor Rob. Usually, it was the focal point of the sanctuary's symbolism, a beacon of sacrifice and redemption. Now, it looked like a stark emblem overshadowed by new dogma, one that demanded silence from the oppressed rather than a voice for the afflicted. Shadows flickered across its carved contours, cast by the dancing light of candles and the tinted rays from the stained glass. Toward the end of the sermon, Pastor Rob launched into a final exhortation. "Let us not be a people who cling to grudges and accusations," he declared, "for that path only kindles wrath. Instead, let us become living testaments to God's mercy. Open your hearts to the possibility that even those who harm us are part of a bigger plan we can't comprehend. By letting go of our need to punish, we open the door to a higher truth." The organ chimed again, signaling the closing hymn. Congregants stood, many of them wiping tears or swaying with an almost hypnotic devotion to the pastor's words. Larry rose mechanically, his knees feeling weak. He tried to sing but found his throat too tight. Each note caught in his chest, as though his body rejected the notion that these messages should be celebrated. He watched Pastor Rob step down from the pulpit and stand at the altar, head bowed in silent prayer, until the organ's last chord faded. When the service concluded, the pews were abuzz with hushed excitement, as though they had all shared in some divine revelation. Larry shuffled out into the aisle, catching bits of conversation from the people around him. "Who are we to judge?" said one older man, adjusting his coat. "It's time we stop relying on lawsuits for justice," added someone else with a fervent nod. The chatter suffocated him. He needed answers, needed to find out why Pastor Rob, a man he had once looked up to for balanced moral guidance, was suddenly preaching what seemed to be a dangerous distortion of Christian compassion. Summoning his courage, Larry edged his way up the aisle, finally catching Pastor Rob just as he stepped away from the altar. "Pastor, can I have a moment?" he asked, voice trembling with equal measures of respect and desperation. Rob hesitated, his brow knotted in a brief flash of tension, but then he nodded. "Of course, Larry. Let's talk in the side chapel." They moved past the rows of pews to a small, ornately designed chapel off to the right. The air there was cooler, tinged with the faint perfume of old wood and dried flowers. An elegant stained glass window depicted a dove descending in a blaze of orange and red glass. The effect should have felt peaceful, but Larry saw only an ominous swirl of shapes, akin to flames licking at the sky. Pastor Rob turned to face him. "You seem troubled," he said gently, though his tone carried an undercurrent of disapproval. Larry tried to steady his voice. "I'm sorry to approach you this way, but I have to ask, do you truly believe we shouldn't—" He paused, choosing his words carefully, not wanting to mention any of his professional duties. "Do you believe we shouldn't hold people accountable when they do terrible things?" Rob's gaze hardened for a moment, then softened into a calm expression. "Larry, the scripture calls us to understand that our ways are not God's ways. We might think it's our role to punish wrongdoing, but punishment, in many cases, simply mirrors the violence we claim to oppose. By seeking retribution, we invite darkness into our own souls." "That might be true in some philosophical sense," Larry responded, his heart pounding. "But what about practical consequences? What about protecting people from someone who might harm them again?" Pastor Rob's mouth pressed into a thin line. "We must rely on God's justice, Larry. He sees everything. Our limited perspective often tempts us to take vengeance into our hands, but Scripture warns against it. 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' saith the Lord." If we keep interfering, we risk complicating God's plan. Sometimes, enduring harm with patience can open the path to grace. Pressing charges in a human court inviteth wrath upon one's own soul. You think you're protecting others, but are you certain you're not also fueling a cycle of animosity? A shiver coursed down Larry's spine. The phrase "inviteth wrath" stuck in his mind like a splinter. He had never heard Pastor Rob use that kind of language, and it jarred him to the core. "I can't believe it's that simple," he said, trying to maintain composure. "What about the moral responsibility to prevent evil from multiplying?" Rob exhaled quietly, as if disappointed. "Preventing evil, my friend, doesn't always come from external force. Sometimes it's conquered through radical kindness, through unconditional forgiveness that leaves no room for further conflict." Larry's thoughts churned. He respected the Christian call to forgiveness, but he couldn't ignore the sense that Pastor Rob had veered into dangerous territory. He thought of the whispering congregants, the rapt faces during the sermon, and the old couple murmuring about leaving all offenses to God's judgment. What frightened him most was how readily people seemed to accept this extreme interpretation, as if it gave them license to avoid confronting uncomfortable realities. I'm not sure I agree," Larry managed. He glanced around, noticing how even in this side chapel, the air seemed thicker than usual, pressing on his lungs. "Sometimes, forgiveness can coexist with accountability. I've always believed that." Pastor Rob offered a sad smile, placing a hand on Larry's shoulder. "You've always been a good man, Larry, dedicated to seeking justice. But my concern is whether your definition of justice might blind you to the deeper divine plan. I fear you're burdening your soul with the notion that you must punish on God's behalf." The warmth of Rob's hand felt unnervingly heavy. Larry gently stepped back, the distance helping him breathe a bit easier. "I'll think about what you said," he murmured, not wanting to start a confrontation here, in the house of worship he'd once called his spiritual home. Rob nodded. "I hope you do. If you ever want to talk further, my door is open." With that, the pastor turned away, drifting back toward the main sanctuary where a cluster of congregants waited, presumably to discuss the sermon. Larry stood alone for a moment, staring at the tinted light that fell across the small altar in this side chapel. The swirling colors of the stained glass, reds, oranges, and yellows, looked less like a symbol of peace and more like a depiction of flames threatening to engulf the dove itself. He exited the chapel, stepping into the main sanctuary once more. The after-service chatter had only grown, echoing off the rafters in a low hum. Several people spoke fervently about how they wouldn't be pressing charges for various wrongs they'd suffered. One woman recounted that she felt liberated just by deciding to drop her small claim suit against a neighbor. Another man chimed in that he was advising his own daughter not to file a complaint about workplace harassment. "Why escalate things?" he said. "We should just trust God to deal with it." Larry could hardly believe what he was hearing. In a matter of weeks, perhaps days, a place that had once provided comfort and moral guidance had transformed into a breeding ground for passivity in the face of injustice. The more he listened, the more his stomach churned. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and he wondered if it was the stale air or just the shock of seeing the congregation unified in such a potentially harmful viewpoint. Fighting through the crowd, he reached the large wooden doors that opened onto the church's front steps. A couple holding hands gave him a polite nod as he passed. They were discussing how it's time the world embraced absolute forgiveness, their voices trembling with a strange mix of excitement and fanaticism. Larry managed a weak smile, then pushed open the doors and stepped outside. The brightness of midday hit him like a slap. He squinted, momentarily disoriented, breathing in the fresh air in desperate gulps. It felt like he'd been holding his breath for hours in that dim sanctuary of stifling dogma. The usual bustle of cars rolling down the street and birds flitting overhead provided a sense of normalcy, but the disquiet in his heart refused to settle. The conversation with Pastor Rob replayed in his mind, each phrase an echo of forbidding finality. He descended the steps with shaky knees, the edges of his vision still tinged with a surreal haze. He was so lost in thought that he barely noticed a woman from the congregation calling his name. He paused for a second, but she seemed hesitant to approach, clutching her handbag like a shield. Larry offered a nod, too emotionally drained to engage in further conversation, and continued on his way. He reached his car, parked in the church's small lot, and leaned against it, letting the gentle breeze ruffle his hair. His heart hammered in his chest, adrenaline still coursing through him. When did everything get so twisted, he wondered. Faith, for him, had always been a guiding light, a source of moral clarity when the world's complexities threatened to overwhelm. But now that clarity seemed to have warped into an insistence on silence, on compliance with wrongdoing as a mark of spiritual maturity. He closed his eyes, trying to recall the pastor's earlier sermons. Once upon a time, Rob had championed the cause of the voiceless and the oppressed. He had recounted stories of biblical heroes standing up to injustices, urging parishioners to actively fight against societal wrongs. Yet all that was absent now, supplanted by a singular emphasis on letting go of any earthly pursuit of accountability. Larry couldn't help but feel betrayed, though he also sensed that the congregation was seeking something that transcended rules and punishments. Maybe they were just desperate for harmony in a fractured world. Yet to Larry's ears, this brand of radical passivity was far more menacing than it appeared. He opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat, his hands trembling against the steering wheel. Memories of simpler Sundays flooded his mind, days when he had found genuine solace within those stained glass walls, content to believe in a balance between mercy and justice. Now, that balance felt shattered. The church's new stance on forgiveness left no room for the possibility that some actions needed to be confronted, not merely overlooked. Starting the engine, Larry let out a shaky breath. He watched as other congregants emerged from the church, dispersing in different directions. Many looked elated, emboldened by the sermon's call to forego all forms of accusation. A few even seemed jubilant, as though they'd been unburdened of the need to struggle for what they once might have called justice. But at what cost? Larry wondered. He pulled out of the lot, merging onto the quiet Sunday street. The pastel facades of local shops glowed in the midday sun, a stark contrast to the gloom that clung to him. In the rearview mirror, the church's steeple receded, its cross stabbing the sky like a silent accusation of its own. With every block he traveled, the numbness in his limbs receded, replaced by a hardening resolve. He refused to believe that faith and accountability were mutually exclusive. Yet no matter how he tried to shake off the sermon, Pastor Rob's words echoed in his consciousness. Pressing charges inviteth wrath upon one's own soul. It was a line he knew he wouldn't easily forget. The quiet fervor in the congregation's faces had embedded itself in his memory, a tableau of unwavering conviction that terrified him more than any physical threat. In such an environment, how many would walk away silenced? How many wrongdoers would flourish under the banner of forgiveness? The thought twisted his stomach. A stoplight turned red, forcing Larry to brake. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, noticing a faint tremor. A child and a woman strolled through the crosswalk, laughing at something the child pointed to in a shop window. Their carefree demeanor momentarily lightened Larry's mood, an ordinary moment of life continuing despite the moral upheaval he'd just witnessed. A fleeting hope stirred within him. Perhaps, in private, some church members doubted Pastor Rob's new extreme stance. Perhaps the hush of acceptance was merely collective hesitation, rather than wholehearted agreement. The light turned green. Larry pressed the gas, weaving toward the outskirts of the neighborhood. He realized he needed time to process what he had just experienced, to realign his sense of right and wrong. Could he still attend this church if it continued down a path where forgiveness meant turning a blind eye to suffering? He glanced at the passenger seat, half expecting to see his old worn Bible there, something he might flip open for solace. But he'd left it at home this morning, thinking he'd use the church's pew Bible. In retrospect, that felt symbolic of everything that had changed. He no longer recognized this place as the home of the balanced faith he once cherished. In the distance, tall oaks lined the street, their leaves shimmering in a gentle breeze. He rolled down the window, letting fresh air wash over him. Slowly, the tension in his shoulders began to ease, though his heart remained heavy. The question that nagged him was simple, yet profound. How had a house of worship, dedicated to compassion and righteousness, twisted mercy into an edict for total submission? He thought back to his conversation with Pastor Rob. The words were spoken so calmly, so assuredly, as if they were the only interpretation of Scripture that existed. Yet Larry knew from years of personal study that Christianity's stance on justice was far more nuanced. There were endless passages about defending the weak, supporting those who had been wronged, and ensuring that evil did not go unchallenged. Where had that emphasis gone? The road curved, and Larry followed its path, passing a cluster of modest houses. Children played in a front yard, their laughter piercing the stillness of the weekend afternoon. For a moment, he imagined the effect of Pastor Rob's message on these young lives. Would they grow up believing they must endure any mistreatment in silence, convinced that seeking help was tantamount to spiritual failure? He shivered at the thought. His car rumbled over a small bridge crossing a trickling stream. The water below sparkled, catching sunlight in a dance of glimmering reflections. The beauty of the scene almost pulled him away from his dark ruminations. Almost. But he couldn't truly escape the sense that he was caught in a surreal dimension, one where moral compasses spun aimlessly. Eventually, he found himself in a familiar residential area, turning onto his own street. The houses here were older, with broad porches and tall windows, and neatly kept lawns. He parked in his driveway and killed the engine. Silence enveloped him, broken only by the rustle of leaves overhead. For a few minutes, he sat there, hands still wrapped around the steering wheel, eyes focused on nothing in particular. Stepping out of the car, he walked to his front door and paused, his keys dangling in one hand. He realized that what he felt was akin to grief. Grief for the church that he now suspected he had lost. He had gone seeking reassurance, hoping to find a familiar beacon of moral support, only to emerge feeling more alone than ever. The fragile line between faith and misguided doctrine seemed to have snapped, leaving him in a precarious emotional freefall. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, the cool interior of his home embracing him. The moment he shut the door, an exhalation burst from his lungs, loud in the stillness. Shoulders sagging, he leaned against the wall, eyes closed. He had come to the service expecting renewal, a spiritual oasis to help him navigate the tumult of a world that felt increasingly cold and confusing. Instead, the sermon had cast him further into doubt, stirring questions he couldn't easily answer. He thought of the final image. Pastor Rob's hand on his shoulder, his eyes filled not with cruelty but with unwavering conviction, urging Larry to abandon earthly justice for the sake of spiritual purity. Larry felt a pang of sadness, realizing that good people could be led astray by a misapplied doctrine, by a misguided belief that silence was the ultimate virtue. A memory flitted through his mind, of a time when Pastor Rob had delivered a different sermon altogether, one that had championed standing up for the oppressed. That memory clashed violently with the reality of today, intensifying Larry's sense of confusion. Now, in the quiet of his home, he understood that the real battle wasn't just an external one. It raged within his own soul, pitting the value of compassion against the imperative of accountability. The sermon at church was just one more sign that the lines between mercy and complicity could blur dangerously when taken to the extreme. Could he maintain his faith while rejecting this new teaching? Would he be ostracized by the very community he had called family for years? He pushed away from the wall, shoulders taut with tension. Looking around, he noticed mundane details, the scuff on the living room floor, the faint smell of last night's dinner still lingering in the air. Normal life went on, but the ground beneath his feet felt less stable than ever. He couldn't shake the feeling that the world had shifted, that an invisible earthquake had rattled the foundation of everything he believed in. Larry hung up his jacket and let his gaze wander to the small bookshelf in the corner, where religious texts mingled with legal tomes. There was the Bible he used for personal study, its spine cracked from years of page-turning. Next to it, volumes on ethics, theology, commentaries on scripture. He wondered if he should open one now, searching for the old words that had once brought him clarity. But he was too exhausted, too shaken. All he could do was let the swirl of emotion subside in its own time. He drifted into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, taking slow sips to steady his nerves. Each swallow felt like a reminder of his physical reality, tangible, grounding. In the silence of the house, the morning's events replayed in his mind. The hushed congregation, the mesmerizing sermon about total forgiveness, the whispered talk of avoiding courts, and finally Pastor Rob's insistence that pressing charges might invite spiritual ruin. It was as if the church had become a place not of redemption, but of enforced submission. Draining the last of the water, Larry set down the glass. His knees still trembled, just as they had when he'd left the sanctuary. The intangible sense of having stepped into a surreal dimension clung to him. The essence of faith, once so comforting, now felt like a labyrinth with no clear exit. He felt nauseated by the possibility that he might have to sever ties with a church he had deeply loved. Yet one flicker of determination lit up in his chest, a small flame of resolve against this wave of confusion. If the church was veering off course, maybe he could fight to steer it back, or at least stand as a dissenting voice, refusing to let the extreme message of unconditional submission go unchallenged. The thought buoyed him for an instant, though he recognized the enormity of such a task. He stepped into the living room and sank into an armchair, letting his head fall back. Outside, a soft wind rustled the leaves of a nearby tree. The branches tapped against the window like tentative knocks, as though nature itself was checking on him. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, focusing on the moment, hoping the steady inflow and outflow of air would bring clarity. Yet Pastor Rob's words echoed in the recesses of his mind. Pressing charges inviteth wrath upon one's own soul. A shiver crept up his spine. He opened his eyes, staring at the ceiling. The hush of the house was vastly different from the hush in the sanctuary that morning, no longer suffocating, but lonely. He felt as though he stood on the threshold of two worlds, one that demanded blind forgiveness at the expense of justice, and one in which moral responsibility required facing wrongdoing head-on, even if it meant conflict. The question that lingered was which world his faith truly belonged to. As the afternoon wore on, the sunlight through his windows shifted, creating slowly drifting squares of golden light on the carpet. He knew he couldn't stay locked in contemplation forever. Eventually, he'd have to make choices about returning to that church, about confronting Pastor Rob's doctrine, about whether faith could survive in a community that seemed determined to stifle accountability. But for now, all he could do was acknowledge the raw swirl of emotions flooding him. Sorrow, confusion, a hint of anger, and even a flicker of hope that not everyone in that congregation had accepted the sermon wholeheartedly. In the end, as he sat there watching the shifting sunlight, he realized he might need to find a new path forward, one that balanced mercy with truth and compassion, with the imperative to protect the vulnerable. It wouldn't be easy, given how persuasive Pastor Rob's sermon had been. But Larry understood that faith, at its core, could not truly flourish in a culture of silent acquiescence. He closed his eyes once more, letting a single phrase float to the surface of his thoughts. He has shown you what is good, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. It was an old biblical admonition, one that had guided him in his life's work. If the church now expected him to abandon acting justly in favor of absolute, unquestioning forgiveness, then he would have to stand apart, trusting that genuine faith required him to seek a more balanced truth. Those words provided a momentary island of calm in a sea of churning doubt. And though Larry's knees still trembled from the surreal dimension he'd walked through that morning, he felt a quiet determination taking root. He would not let mercy become a twisted tool that excused wrongdoing. He would not let the call to forgive mutate into a license for silence. Perhaps that made him an outlier in his faith community now, but if so, he was prepared to shoulder that burden. Outside, the afternoon sun continued its slow descent, casting elongated shadows across his yard. Each passing minute brought him closer to the complexities of a new day, one where he would inevitably confront the implications of what he had experienced in that stained-glass sanctuary. For now, he let himself rest, grappling with the enormity of the church's shift and all the difficult questions it left in its wake. His faith, battered and uncertain, still flickered within him like a small, steadfast flame, lighting the way through the encroaching darkness. Part 4. The Rally of the Order. Larry first noticed something amiss the moment he stepped onto the main boulevard that cut through the heart of the city. The sky above was a dull gray, weighed down by thick clouds that seemed to muffle the usual clamor of midday traffic. Storefronts, typically lively with displays and bright signage, felt subdued in this grim half-light. Even the honks and engine growls of passing cars sounded distant, as though absorbed by an invisible wall of tension. He had come this way only to pick up some paperwork from a nearby office, expecting to slip in and out unnoticed. Instead, he was greeted by the growing echo of agitated voices reverberating off the tall buildings that loomed over the street. He couldn't quite see the source of the commotion at first. It seemed to emanate from a few blocks down, carried on the wind in ragged bursts of chanting. The syllables weren't yet clear, just an unsettling throb of distant rage. Still, there was no mistaking that an angry crowd had gathered. As he inched his way forward, weaving around pedestrians who hurried away from the noise, he noticed that nearly everyone was trying to steer clear. Some folks ducked into side streets, others loitered in doorways to watch from what they hoped was a safe remove. A few simply pretended not to hear anything at all, walking briskly with faces downturned, determined not to be drawn into whatever upheaval awaited around the bend. Closer now, Larry began to catch phrases barked through a bullhorn. "We have the right to hurt," a voice boomed, followed by a volley of cheers. Then came another chant, shriller, like an alarm call. "Punishment is the real crime." The words coalesced into a bizarre refrain that sent an uneasy prickling along Larry's arms. He had witnessed plenty of demonstrations in his line of work, protests on behalf of labor rights, protests against corporate corruption, even heated picket lines outside courthouses. But there was something uniquely disturbing about this group's message. It wasn't a plea for fairness or justice or recognition. It was a rallying cry for the justification of harm itself. At the corner of Main and 10th, the sidewalk opened onto a broad plaza, usually reserved for weekend farmers markets or holiday fairs. Today, it was occupied by a surging mass of people. They carried signs, some printed, some crudely scrawled, all brandishing violent slogans. Larry spotted a tall man near the front, hefting a placard emblazoned with "Pain is our freedom." To the right, a woman with streaked hair waved a banner proclaiming, "Victims are weaklings." The conglomeration of messages felt like a twisted carnival, a sideshow of cruelty that assaulted both logic and decency. The group, apparently calling itself the Sovereign Offense Order, moved in loose formation, circling the plaza in undulating waves. They shouted in unison, high on their collective mania, "We have the right to hurt. We have the right to hurt." Each repetition seemed to feed off the last, growing louder, sharper, more confrontational. A scattering of onlookers lined the periphery, drawn perhaps by morbid curiosity. Yet few dared to speak up or counter-protest. There was a palpable sense of fear in the air, reinforced by the group's aggressive stance and slogans that celebrated inflicting suffering. Larry hovered at the edge of the plaza, grappling with the surreal magnitude of what he was seeing. The city he knew wasn't perfect. There were always issues, always tensions simmering below the surface. But this felt like a raw manifestation of something new, something far more corrosive than the usual brand of discontent. He took a few cautious steps forward, weaving between pedestrians who gawked from behind parked cars or stood half-hidden in shuttered storefront entrances. The entire street carried an undercurrent of dread, a silent agreement among the bystanders that engaging with these demonstrators could be dangerous. Stealing a closer look, Larry noticed the distinct attire of the protesters. Some wore everyday business suits, as though they had stepped directly out of boardrooms or law firms. Others dressed in casual weekend clothes, jeans, t-shirts, sneakers. A few looked downright menacing, clad in dark hoodies or spiked leather jackets. Yet all of them sported a small emblem pinned to their clothing, a stylized fist, superimposed over an open mouth as if the fist were emerging from it. Beneath that emblem, scrawled in angular letters, was the phrase, "Sovereign Offense Order." The crowd's incongruous makeup only fueled Larry's disquiet. This wasn't a fringe group of a dozen or so diehards. It looked like a cross-section of everyday life. Neighbors, professionals, students, united under a banner that insisted wrongdoing should be glorified, that punishment itself was the greatest injustice. The bullhorn crackled again, and a woman's voice shrieked, "If you can't handle offense, you don't belong here." Deafening applause followed. The tension in the air felt almost electric, a crackling mania that threatened to surge at the slightest provocation. Larry's heart drummed painfully in his chest. As a man who had devoted his life to upholding the law, it was almost impossible to process the slogans being hurled about. He tried to recall if he'd heard rumors of this organization, perhaps vague mentions in the local news or fleeting references among colleagues. But no, this scale of demonstration had to be a first. He wondered where they all had come from, and how many more might be waiting to join them. Edging even closer, he caught sight of a makeshift stage at the far end of the plaza, a flatbed truck repurposed to hold amplifiers and microphones. A gaunt man in a crisp shirt stood at the front, leading the crowd in chants. Two supporters flanked him, each brandishing a picket sign. "Victims are parasites, and stop coddling the weak." Their rage-filled recitations pierced the air, causing more pedestrians to shrink back. A mother tugged her child sharply by the hand, hurrying away before the child could fully absorb the hateful spectacle. Larry considered leaving too. Nothing in his day's plan had prepared him for wading into a swirl of incitement and malice. But as he turned to go, he froze. Out of the corner of his eye, he glimpsed someone he recognized, a face he had seen from a distance, day after day, inside a courtroom. The shock of it nearly stole his breath. A man from the jury panel assigned to a current case. He stood among the protesters, wearing the same pin of the Sovereign Offense Order on his lapel. Not only that, he was handing out flyers to passers-by, occasionally stepping out of the main throng to intercept anyone showing mild curiosity. Larry's pulse quickened with dread, awareness, and a powerful sense of betrayal. This juror, whom we'll call Mr. Caldwell, had seemed reserved, maybe a touch skeptical during selection. Nothing particularly stood out about him aside from a stoic demeanor. Yet here he was, immersed in this sea of hostility, personally distributing literature that read, in blocky print, "Victims lie for attention." Larry watched as Caldwell pressed the flyers into the hands of two teenage onlookers, who seemed too startled to refuse. Unable to contain his alarm, Larry took a few stealthy steps closer. He needed to confirm what he was seeing. Could Caldwell really be part of this menacing demonstration, publicly endorsing the view that people had the right to hurt others unimpeded, that punishment for wrongdoing was the true evil? The scene was so surreal that Larry's mind struggled to reconcile the calm, unassuming figure in the jury box with the zealot handing out hateful pamphlets in the street. Caldwell pivoted toward a passerby, a middle-aged man who had paused uncertainly at the edge of the crowd. He thrust a flyer at him. "Here, read this," Caldwell said with barely restrained fervor. "Learn the truth, that society's obsession with blaming offenders only creates new victims. You can't punish human nature. It's oppressive." The man stared at him, wide-eyed, then scurried off, leaving Caldwell to resume his impassioned distribution. Larry's stomach churned. He'd heard the chants from the stage, but seeing this single individual, a supposed pillar of civic duty, peddle the sovereign offense order's twisted message drove home how deeply this ideology could worm its way into everyday life. What would this mean for the outcome of that ongoing case? Or for any case where wrongdoing needed to be confronted and justice served? The ramifications were staggering. A single juror with such entrenched beliefs could skew the entire process, undermining the principle that facts and law determine guilt or innocence. Glancing back at the heart of the protest, Larry noticed that the chanting had escalated to a roar. Large groups of demonstrators now marched in frantic circles, brandishing signs and shouting slogans at unsuspecting passers-by. Some had begun slapping stickers on lampposts and store windows, jagged silhouettes of fists and the words, "Offense forever." Others scrawled graffiti across bare walls, "No more courts, criminals are free, and violence/freedom." The swirl of aggression and bizarre celebration for cruelty made Larry's head spin. It was as if the entire plaza had become a stage for raw cynicism, a place where any notion of empathy was drowned out by the bellowing of those who relished harm. The cityscape itself seemed to react. Normally, this plaza was vibrant and lively, a space for street performers or leisurely lunches. Today, the shops that bordered it kept their doors locked, their windows displaying hastily taped signs. Closed for renovation, or simply, closed. The owners, it seemed, had chosen caution over confrontation. A group of tourists, camera straps around their necks, watched from the far side, exchanging uneasy glances as they tried to figure out if they were in immediate danger. One of them snapped a few pictures, then lowered their camera, evidently disturbed by the malevolent fervor radiating from the crowd. Larry lingered near a marble pillar, wrestling with the urge to intervene. But what could he possibly do, single-handed, against an organized group chanting about their right to hurt people? He was off-duty, lacking any immediate authority to disperse a demonstration, especially one that, from a legal standpoint, might still be considered peaceful protest as long as it didn't break property or threaten direct violence. Yet the tension thrumming through the air made it feel like an explosion was imminent, some inevitable confrontation where this group would lash out physically to match their verbal aggression. Then the bullhorn cracked again, and the gaunt man on the flatbed truck spoke. "We are the sovereign offense order. We exist to remind the world that being offended is a choice, and punishing those who offend is the true brutality. Down with trials, down with jails. We stand for total freedom, even the freedom to harm." Applause rained down, fists pumping in the air. "Today, we show this city that we are done coddling the so-called victims." A wave of chanting followed. "No more trials. No more trials. No more trials." The repetition built to a fever pitch, merging with the rumble of bodies moving en masse. It was enough to send shivers down Larry's spine. He scanned the scene, searching for any sign of law enforcement. A few uniformed officers stood well away, forming a loose perimeter. Their expressions were grim and watchful, but none made a move. Likely they'd been instructed to maintain a hands-off approach unless the protesters started destroying property or attacking bystanders. Meanwhile, the crowd's energy swelled like a rising tide of anger. As if to confirm the sense of creeping madness, a group near the stage took to lighting flares. Harsh red smoke belched upward, curling around the placards, painting the demonstration in macabre colors. Against the swirl of red haze, the scrawled slogans looked even more menacing. The acrid smell prickled in Larry's nose, and he coughed, stepping back to avoid the fumes. Around him, a few watchers murmured in alarm. One man shook his head, muttering something about how it's gone too far. But he stopped short of intervening, evidently preferring safety and distance. A chant started anew, orchestrated by the bullhorn-wielding leader. "We have the right to hurt. Punishment is the real crime. We have the right to hurt. Punishment is the real crime." The synergy of voices rattled the plaza's windows. Larry watched a father tug his daughter behind him as they skirted the edge, deciding the route to the nearest exit. All around, civilians who wanted no part of the Sovereign Offense Order's demonstration struggled to navigate around them, wearing expressions of disbelief or fear. Summoning his nerve, Larry resolved to approach Caldwell. The notion of a juror aligned with this chaos was unthinkable. He needed at least to gauge the man's reaction, or to confirm that it was truly the same person. Carefully, he made his way around the fringes of the protest, stepping between a pair of protesters who were slapping stickers on a bus stop shelter. He could hardly believe how brazenly they defaced public property. Neither seemed to care that passers-by were watching. They slapped on a final sticker, a stylized image of a scowling face with a gag, underlined by the words, "Offend or die," and turned to follow the main rally. With each footstep, Larry felt his throat tighten. What if Caldwell recognized him? The potential ramifications twisted his stomach into knots. Still, he pressed on. The swirling red smoke from the flares cast an unsettling glow over the man's features. But Larry had no doubt now. This was the very same individual who sat in that jury box, day after day, appearing calm and impassive. Caldwell wore casual clothes now, but the face was unmistakable. The neatly combed hair, the clipped mustache, the slight squint in his left eye. And that pinned emblem told the rest of the story. In a lull between chants, Caldwell glanced toward Larry. Their eyes connected, and for the briefest moment, Caldwell's face registered shock. Immediately, he turned away, as if to hide behind the rowdy protesters circling him. Larry's mind spun. If Caldwell was distributing flyers that claimed victims lie for attention, how could he possibly be impartial in any legal proceeding? The entire premise of a fair trial might be compromised. But confronting Caldwell here, in the midst of this mania, seemed dangerous. The mania of the crowd might turn on him if he pushed too hard. To Larry's horror, Caldwell continued passing out the flyers. He reached for a tall stack from a bag slung over his shoulder, thrusting them at random onlookers. "Educate yourself," he barked, ignoring the stunned reactions of those who took the paper. Larry watched a teen in a hoodie glance down at the flyer, read a line or two, and then toss it to the ground in disgust. Caldwell didn't seem bothered. He just moved on, ready to hand another slip of hateful propaganda to the next potential convert. Despite his revulsion, Larry couldn't tear his eyes away. The demonstration was a living nightmare of reversed morality, a gathering that glorified cruelty and mocked the notion of accountability. And in the midst of it all, a man tasked with weighing evidence in a courtroom was cheering them on. The thought weighed on Larry like an enormous stone on his chest, a prescient sign of how deeply the sovereign offense order's ideology might have spread. He took a step back, deciding it was too perilous to remain so close. He needed time to think, to process what he had just witnessed. As he navigated away from the center of the demonstration, he could hear the chanting swell to a new crescendo. "No more trials, no more trials, victims lie, victims lie." The words hammered at Larry's psyche. It was as though reason itself were unraveling in the face of a collective decision to reject empathy and celebrate aggression. Now at the edge of the plaza, nearly colliding with a couple who seemed on the verge of running, Larry glanced over his shoulder one last time. Through the haze of red smoke and shifting bodies, he could still make out Caldwell's figure. The juror's face flickered in the uneven light as he spoke animatedly with a group of protesters who hung on his every word. Then, as if in slow motion, Caldwell lifted one of those flyers, "Victims lie for attention," above his head and waved it triumphantly in the air, prompting another round of cheers from the crowd. For Larry, the sight was like watching a foundational pillar of his community be yanked out at the roots. If a sitting juror could stand so unapologetically with these agitators, what else lurked beneath the city's surface? How many others might be wearing the sovereign offense order emblem under their jackets, waiting for an opportunity to rewrite the rules of civility and justice? The dread that gripped him was nearly paralyzing. The chanting roared, accompanied by the continued blast of flares. He saw flickers of bright cloth from a protester's banner reading, "Freedom to offend," as the crowd fanned out, taking up more space in the plaza. The sound bounced off the surrounding buildings, magnified in haunting echoes that seemed to chase after innocent bystanders. At that moment, it felt as though the entire city was perched on a precipice, teetering between the rule of law and a terrifying new normal where aggression was lionized and the concept of justice was scoffed at. Unable to stand it any longer, Larry merged with a group of onlookers slipping down a side street, the roar of the protest lingering at his back like an unwanted specter. Even a block away, he could still hear the bullhorns call and catch glimpses of that swirling red haze drifting upward. He rubbed a hand across his mouth, trying to steady himself. How could he return to daily life, to the notion that everything was business as usual, when he had just witnessed such an unhinged display of hostility and recognized within it one of the very people entrusted to uphold the law? He continued along the side street until the sounds of the demonstration dulled to a faint hum. More than once, he caught a reflection of his own face in the windows of parked cars, pale, grim, and haunted by disbelief. It was as though he had ventured into a corner of the city he'd never seen before, one that existed in a parallel reality where rational discourse had been turned inside out. He noticed bits of graffiti even here, tagging on the sides of dumpsters and brick walls. Hurting is human. Stop defending victims. The message had clearly spread, its noxious ideology seeping into the city's fabric. Larry paused near a boarded-up cafe, closed for reasons unknown. He pressed his palm against the rough plywood covering the windows, needing something solid to anchor him. His mind reeled, replaying the scene. The swirling crowd, the twisted slogans, Caldwell's face illuminated in the smoky haze. The entire spectacle had broadcast a singular narrative, that the old rules, where harm was condemned and accountability mattered, were up for debate. For a moment, he remembered the startled faces of the bystanders, the ones who had chosen flight over confrontation. Could he blame them? The Sovereign Offense Order's demonstration wasn't something a single voice could easily counter. They were collectively confident, brazen, and whipped into a frenzy by their shared conviction that society owed them the freedom to harm others without consequence. Perhaps the silence of onlookers was part shock, part self-preservation. Yet that silence also seemed to grant the group a terrifying power, as though every unchallenged chant fueled their cause. He swallowed hard, the metallic taste of fear lingering on his tongue. This was no fringe phenomenon. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, anyone could be hiding that emblem beneath their jacket. Or, like Caldwell, they might already be brandishing it in broad daylight. The unraveling of moral consensus now felt imminent, like threads pulled from a once sturdy tapestry of community values. The question looming in Larry's mind, heavy as an anvil, was how to grapple with it. How to stand for accountability in a world that was increasingly enthralled by the rhetoric of unrepentant offense. Taking a long, shaky breath, he stepped away from the boarded cafe. The day had begun as any other, but now it was saturated with the knowledge that he wasn't just facing a handful of misguided individuals. He was witnessing the emergence of a movement with the potential to undermine every principle he believed in. The next steps he took, the choices he made after seeing Caldwell among those ranks, would be crucial. But at that moment, his immediate priority was simply to gather himself, to quell the fear rattling his composure. He cast one final glance in the direction of the plaza, barely visible behind the row of buildings. The chanting still reverberated through the streets, echoing like a warning siren. "We have the right to hurt," drifted on the wind, accompanied by a fresh roar of approval. Larry closed his eyes, letting the unsettling truth sink in. His community was indeed unraveling, its center threatened by a twisted morality that embraced aggression as a virtue. And in the midst of that unraveling, a potential juror, supposedly impartial, shamelessly promoted the group's hateful message. Ducking his head, Larry walked away from the protest, the city's dissonant chorus fading, but never truly leaving his ears. He felt every footstep as a testament to how swiftly the world had shifted under him. Before, the city had at least upheld the facade of justice, of a shared understanding that harming others was wrong. But now, that facade was cracking. And as the chanting of the Sovereign Offense Order pulsed in the distance, Larry could only steel himself for whatever storm awaited, uncertain if truth and decency still had any hope of prevailing against such a brazen, disorienting tide of hostility. Part 5. Shifting Allegiances in the System. Larry Stone could feel the tension the moment he stepped into the courtroom on the second day of Sally Shields' testimony. The overhead fluorescents cast their usual sterile glow across the wood-paneled walls, but something in the air had changed overnight. An uncanny stillness hung there, as though the entire room was holding its breath. Even the hum of the ventilation system seemed muffled, swallowed by an undercurrent of hushed anticipation. A few spectators had arrived earlier than usual, clustering in small knots along the gallery benches. Some scrolled through their phones, while others leaned in close to whisper, the pall of apprehension rendering them quiet. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, one that signaled the approach of something crucial, maybe even seismic. He carried his briefcase down the center aisle, noticing how each footstep landed with a brisk tap that felt far too loud. The echoes rippled across the polished floor and fluttered in his chest. He glanced toward the jury box, where half the jurors were already seated. A couple consulted their notepads, brows creased. One fiddled with her pen, spinning it between nervous fingers. Only one or two met Larry's gaze, and those fleeting glances radiated unease rather than the empathy he'd hoped to see for the day's testimony. After all, Sally Shields' account, painful though it was, should have rallied a sense of compassion. But the atmosphere here seemed decidedly cold. Moving to the prosecutor's table, Larry set down his briefcase and removed a folder containing the notes he'd prepared. He flipped through them mechanically, though his mind was elsewhere, attuned to the stifling mood. The defense team, led by a tall, sharp-eyed attorney named Carlson, was already in place, laptops and files arranged in neat rows. Carlson offered a curt nod across the aisle, a half-smile that felt more predatory than polite. Larry responded with a tight, professional nod of his own. He had faced many defense attorneys in his career, but the chill that accompanied Carlson's presence was new. It was as though Carlson understood that the changing winds in public sentiment might grant him unspoken advantages. A door at the side of the courtroom opened, and Sally Shields walked in with the bailiff beside her. She moved slowly, as though every step required immense effort. Her face was drawn. Deep circles hollowed her eyes. She wore a conservative blouse, pale yellow, but the color did nothing to brighten her wan complexion. The hush that greeted her was absolute, giving Larry the sense that the entire room held her under a microscope. Even a few reporters in the back row lowered their voices, cameras at the ready in case anything dramatic occurred. Judge Rutledge entered next, black robes fluttering. "All rise," the bailiff called, and everyone stood. The scraping of chairs against the floor was jarringly loud in the silence. Once the judge settled behind the bench, the crowd resumed their seats. The judge exchanged a few formal words with both counsel, then signaled for Larry to continue his examination of the witness. Larry nodded and stepped forward, trying to shake off the tightness in his chest. As he made his way to the podium, he could feel every eye in the room on him, but more importantly, on Sally. He offered her a small nod. "Good morning, Ms. Shields," he began, voice steady but gentle. "I understand how difficult it must be to continue your testimony today. Still, I appreciate your willingness to be here and share your account." Sally took a shaky breath. "Yes," she said, hardly louder than a whisper. The microphone caught the quiver in her voice, amplifying it throughout the courtroom. Larry knew how daunting it was for her to recount the events of her assault in such a public setting, especially with so many pairs of eyes that seemed oddly skeptical. Keeping his tone comforting, Larry approached methodically. "Yesterday, you began describing the initial incident. Today, I'd like for you to tell the court about the immediate aftermath, what you experienced physically and emotionally once you managed to leave the location. Could you walk us through that?" Sally closed her eyes as though bracing herself. I remember my clothing being torn. My blouse was ripped open. My skirt was ruined. I was bruised. On my wrists, my arms, my thighs. There were cuts on my back from where I was thrown against a rough surface." She hesitated, swallowing back tears. "At first I thought I could handle it alone. But when I looked at myself in the mirror afterward, my body was trembling uncontrollably." A stirring passed through the spectators. Some leaned forward, as if expecting some dramatic revelation. Others shifted impatiently, arms crossed. The jury's reactions were mixed. Larry saw one juror's eyes go wide with what he hoped was empathy, but next to her, another stifled a sigh, glancing down at the pen in his hand. It was a subtle gesture, but it grated on him. These were the kinds of details that either undermined or bolstered the legitimacy of a victim's story. And this morning, it felt like every syllable Sally uttered met with quiet resistance in the air. As she continued, describing how she'd sought immediate medical attention and documented her injuries, Larry's stomach churned at the stoic, almost indifferent expressions among some jurors. Once or twice, he heard a faint murmur from the spectator rows, a mild scoff, or a whispered comment that didn't sound remotely sympathetic. He could hardly believe these details, which should evoke empathy, were generating mild hostility instead. He resisted the urge to turn and confront the onlookers. Instead, he kept his focus on Sally, guiding her through the narrative with care. She recounted the threats hurled at her during the attack. Each word made her voice strain. Larry's own chest felt tight in shared tension, and he glanced at the judge. Judge Rutledge maintained a carefully neutral expression, though something about his posture, shoulders slightly hunched, chin lowered, gave Larry the impression that even the presiding authority was uncomfortable. But was that discomfort for Sally? Or was it a hesitation to deal with the raw intensity of the allegations? When Sally described the bruises, how they took days to fade, and how her wrists had shown clear finger marks, Larry braced for the defense's cross-examination. He wasn't disappointed. Carlson almost leapt out of his seat, eyes flashing. The moment Larry indicated he had no further direct questions for now, Carlson wasted no time. He rose, buttoned his jacket, and strode toward the witness stand. With a voice dripping with a veneer of concern, Carlson addressed Sally. "Ms. Shields," he said, "thank you for providing such details. However, I'd like to explore your reaction to these events. You've testified that you felt traumatized and sought medical attention for bruises. Is that correct?" Sally nodded. "Yes." Carlson tapped his chin as if in deep thought. "So, you felt that these bruises, these superficial lacerations, were reason enough to go to a hospital. Did the doctors find anything life-threatening? Broken bones? Internal bleeding? Anything that justified an extended stay in the hospital?" Sally faltered, glancing at Larry. "Well, no, but you did stay overnight, isn't that right?" "Yes," she said, voice smaller now. "The doctors recommended it because I was in shock and—" Carlson cut her off with a polite raise of his hand. "Of course, you were experiencing what you termed shock. But do you believe that might just be an extreme emotional reaction to a situation that, while undoubtedly unpleasant, is part of the unfortunate realities of adult life?" Larry felt an immediate surge of anger. "Objection," he snapped, unable to contain the outrage. "That's an insensitive and entirely speculative assertion. The witness is describing a violent assault. There's no cause to reduce her injuries as unpleasant realities of adult life." Judge Rutledge cleared his throat and looked from Larry to Carlson, eventually returning his gaze to Sally. After a brief pause, he said, "Sustained. Mr. Carlson, rephrase or move on." Carlson offered a polished smile. "Certainly, Your Honor. Ms. Shields, your hospital records indicate that your injuries were largely superficial, correct? Bruises, minor cuts, no lasting harm?" Sally opened her mouth, clearly at a loss for words. My wrist was sprained," she managed. "And it wasn't just the physical part. I still am, traumatized." He struck again. "Yes, traumatized. You mentioned nightmares, hypervigilance, an inability to carry out your daily routine. But Ms. Shields, can I ask, do you consider yourself a resilient person? Because it sounds like you may be overly fragile for the realities of life if bruises and the memory of conflict have disrupted your world to this extent." Another wave of murmurs rippled through the jury box. One or two nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if the suggestion resonated with them. Larry's jaw clenched. What kind of twisted logic was this, turning a victim's natural psychological distress into evidence of weakness? And more alarming, why did it sound like a portion of the court was ready to entertain that perspective? Sally's eyes brimmed with tears, but she straightened her shoulders. I'm not fragile. I was attacked. It wasn't a mere conflict. It was an assault." Carlson maintained his calm. "I see. Perhaps, though, this assault is being overemphasized? People bruise easily, and not every bruise indicates a catastrophe. Are we sure that the alleged offender is fully to blame for the emotional turmoil you've been experiencing? Could it be that your own sensitivity is amplifying the impact?" Larry was on his feet again. "Objection," he almost shouted. "The defense is badgering the witness, insinuating that her legitimate trauma is a matter of personal fragility. This line of questioning is inappropriate." The judge nodded slowly, though his eyes flicked down. "Sustained. Mr. Carlson, watch the tone of your inquiry." The defense attorney shrugged with feigned humility. "I have no further questions for now, Your Honor." He stepped away from the witness stand, leaving Sally visibly shaken. Larry wanted to approach Sally right then and there, to offer some reassurance, but protocol demanded he remain behind his table until the judge excused the witness. Sally looked across the room, tears still trembling at the corners of her eyes. The hush in the audience remained, yet it was a hush that felt complicit, as if a portion of them silently agreed with Carlson. Larry could hardly believe how drastically public sentiment had shifted from the old days, when victim testimony was seldom greeted with such brazen hostility. Judge Rutledge announced a short recess. The tension released in a sudden shuffle as jurors, attorneys, and spectators rose to stretch their legs. Sally left the stand, eyes downcast, as a bailiff escorted her to a side room for privacy. Larry told himself he'd go check on her in a moment. First, he needed to collect his thoughts. Stepping out into the corridor, he discovered a scene that made his stomach drop. Reporters had gathered in a cluster near the vending machines, cameras at the ready. The moment he emerged, microphones were thrust toward him. "Mr. Stone, is this witness as credible as you claim, given her extreme reaction?" One journalist called out, voice tinged with skepticism. Another reporter demanded, "What would you say to those who believe taxpayer money is being wasted on what might be an overblown personal grievance?" He tried to keep his composure. "Sally Shields' testimony is both valid and supported by evidence," he replied, as evenly as he could manage. "This is a serious case, and we wouldn't pursue it if we didn't feel the facts warranted legal intervention." Several cameras flashed, capturing his clenched jaw and somber posture. A tall reporter with a notepad interrupted. "How do you address concerns from certain community members that Ms. Shields just can't handle real life? Should the legal system be used every time someone experiences a stressful event?" Larry bit back a retort. He forced a level tone. "We're dealing with an alleged assault, not a simple stressful event. The legal system is specifically designed for cases where one person's rights and physical safety have been violated. That's exactly what this trial is about." Feeling his self-control slip, he gave a curt nod and excused himself, hurrying to find Sally. He navigated the halls, passing more spectators and a few other lawyers. Their expressions ranged from politely guarded to openly disapproving, as though they blamed him for dragging the city through yet another protracted trial. Each snatch of conversation he overheard seemed to place a cloud of doubt over the entire process. Isn't she exaggerating? What if she's just seeing an opportunity for attention or compensation? This is draining public resources. The words felt like blows, each one further eroding the concept of compassion that should have underpinned any assault case. Finally, he located Sally in a small interview room, slumped in a metal chair. She pressed a tissue to her eyes. A female court advocate stood beside her, murmuring something softly. The moment Larry entered, the advocate excused herself, leaving them alone. Sally's tear-stricken face turned upward, and the heartbreak in her expression seemed to fill the room. Despite the tension that had weighed on him all morning, Larry felt a surge of protective resolve. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, as if she'd done something wrong. Larry shook his head, approaching with careful steps. "For what? You have every right to express your trauma. That's the point of testifying, to let the court know what happened to you." She looked down at her trembling hands. I can't believe how everyone seems to—" Her voice caught. "I'm treated like I'm weak, or making a big deal of nothing. I can tell some of them don't care about what I went through." He wanted to tell her it was only a vocal minority, but from his vantage point, the tide of apathy and resentment seemed alarmingly pervasive. "Try to stay strong," he said instead, gently squeezing her shoulder. "We have evidence on our side, and that means a lot, even if the atmosphere is turning." Sally nodded, though her face betrayed doubt. "I've never felt so alone," she confessed. "Like it's me against the world." Larry lingered for a moment, letting her calm down. Then, mindful of the schedule, he said softly, "Court's about to resume. You don't have to go back on the stand today, but the defense might recall you for more questions later in the week. Are you up to it?" She sat upright, taking a deep breath. "Yes," she said, voice trembling but resolute. "I'll see this through." Larry gave her a tight, supportive smile. "That's good," he said. "We're in this together." After escorting Sally to a private exit, ensuring she could slip out without reporters ambushing her again, Larry headed back to the courtroom. The tension that greeted him was no different from before. If anything, the atmosphere had grown more strained, as though the recess had given everyone time to nurse their skepticism rather than their empathy. He returned to the prosecutor's table and arranged his notes, bracing for the next segment of the day, which would likely be witness statements from forensic experts and possibly a detective. To his dismay, the audible murmurs in the gallery persisted. He caught a few brazen remarks drifting from the back rows. "She's milking it. Did you see how she started crying again? Ridiculous. This is such a waste of public funds. We have real crimes to deal with. Why didn't she defend herself? If she's this fragile, that's on her." Each snippet stung like a wasp. The shift in public and courtroom sentiment felt like a fever dream. In his years of prosecuting, Larry had witnessed plenty of cynicism, but never a level of open disdain for a victim's plight this palpable. Sure, some high-profile cases attracted naysayers, but this was something else. A widespread contagion of doubt and scorn directed at anyone who dared claim they'd been wronged. When the judge returned to the bench, he took a moment to shuffle his notes before speaking. "We'll continue with the prosecution's next witness," he said, voice subdued. "Mr. Stone, proceed." The next hour was occupied by the testimony of a medical professional who confirmed the bruises, sprain, and physical harm consistent with Sally's story. Yet even this straightforward testimony wasn't greeted with solemn acceptance. Carlson again cast subtle doubts, suggesting that the injuries might have been over-documented, or that the lasting impact was psychological rather than physical. At one point, the expert bristled visibly, glaring at the defense attorney as he tried to imply that Sally's medical records were a sign of her overly cautious personality. The day's hearing concluded with the detective who had taken Sally's initial statement. His account was calm and methodical, explaining how the police gathered evidence, cross-referenced times, and interviewed witnesses who could place the alleged offender in the vicinity. Objectively, it was strong, corroborative testimony. Yet as the detective answered questions, the same stony faces in the jury remained. A few nodded, but with an edge of ambivalence. Others averted their eyes, tapping pens as though counting the minutes until they could leave. Eventually, the judge looked at the clock and adjourned for the day. "Court is in recess until tomorrow," he said. "All parties are reminded not to discuss the case outside these walls." With that, he banged the gavel, and the tension shattered into the scuff of chairs and the murmur of relieved conversation. Larry closed his files, heartsick. He knew justice was never guaranteed, but seeing the unsympathetic air that had permeated the proceedings set his nerves on edge. He packed up, wanting only to retreat to his office and regroup. Yet as he stepped into the hallway, a swirl of media personnel converged, not on him, but on Sally, who had tried to slip out discreetly after re-entering for the day's end. Microphones nearly poked her face, and the barrage of questions was relentless. "Why are you dragging this out?" one asked sharply. "Aren't you wasting taxpayer money by insisting on such a detailed trial?" "What do you say to accusations that you're being overly dramatic?" another demanded, thrusting a digital recorder in her direction. Sally recoiled, tears shining in her eyes. She clasped her hands together, looking around as though searching for an escape route. The scene was so invasive that Larry felt immediate anger spike in his veins. He hurried forward, intervening by stepping between her and the cameras. "That's enough," he said firmly. "Ms. Shields has no comment at this time." He guided her away, ignoring the shouted follow-ups and the pointed glances from passing bystanders. One reporter, chasing them a few steps, called out, "Shouldn't the public know how she's spending their dollars in court?" The question hit Larry like a slap. The entire concept of ensuring justice, once a bedrock principle, was being framed as a frivolous expense. He clenched his jaw, deliberately choosing not to dignify it with a response. Outside, the late afternoon sun washed over the courthouse steps. The usual bustle of city life continued, but it felt distant from the swirling storm of cynicism inside. Sally paused at the top of the stairs, catching her breath. Cameras still flashed from a modest distance, but she seemed a bit steadier now that she was out of direct confrontation. Larry stayed close, quietly guiding her down the steps. At the bottom, she turned to him, voice trembling. "I can't believe—" Her words trailed off, tears threatening to spill again. He held her gaze. "I know," he said softly. "The narrative has flipped in a way I never thought I'd see." Indeed, it felt like the entire city had awoken to a bizarre new reality, one where the victim of a violent act was forced to defend her own pursuit of justice, where a supposed duty to punish wrongdoers was regarded as a burden on society, and where empathy had been replaced with a scathing skepticism. Larry helped her into a waiting taxi, reassuring her that he'd be in touch about the next day's proceedings. She nodded gratefully, thanking him in a voice so subdued it was almost lost in the bustle of the street. As the cab pulled away, Larry stood on the curb, feeling the weight of the day press on him. On any other occasion, the details Sally recounted, torn clothing, menacing threats, bruises, would have galvanized the courtroom, summoning a collective resolve to see justice done. Today, he'd witnessed the opposite. The public's trust in the system seemed eroded by a wave of cynicism, placing the onus on the victim to justify her emotional state instead of on the accused to answer for the harm inflicted. It was more than a legal matter now. It was a societal shift, evident in the stares of jurors who found Sally's tears and trembling voice burdensome rather than poignant. Looking back at the looming courthouse facade, Larry felt a flicker of doubt about the trial's future. Even strong evidence might not sway an audience already leaning toward viewing Sally as a burden. He exhaled slowly, pushing that doubt aside. He had a job to do, and as long as there was a shred of hope, he'd fight for it. But the question was how to repair a climate so hostile to someone simply seeking accountability. Squaring his shoulders, he turned and walked back up the steps, determined to plan for the next day's arguments. His thoughts churned with strategies for recentering the conversation on the assault's brutal facts rather than on Sally's emotional response. But the deeper worry clung to him. If empathy was truly dying in that courtroom, no amount of fact or logic might suffice. And so ended the day's proceedings, overshadowed by an unsettling realization. Sally Shields' plight was no longer just a test of the case's merits. It had become a crucible for how society responded to victims in general. Where once there would have been unwavering condemnation of violent acts, now there was an air of reluctance, an instinct to blame the complainant. Larry found himself praying that the system would somehow right itself, that truth would prevail over cynicism before the final gavel fell. Because if it didn't, Sally wouldn't be the only casualty. Justice itself would suffer a crippling blow, seemingly sanctioned by the very people sworn to uphold it. Part 6. Blood on the Pavement. Larry Stone slid onto the last vacant stool at the diner's counter, bones weary from another tumultuous day. The entire place offered a semblance of peace he desperately needed. Rows of pies turning behind the glass case, a cloud of greasy heat perpetually wafting out from the open kitchen. Overhead, a flickering neon sign in the window buzzed softly, proclaiming diner in bold pink letters that cast everything in a faint, lurid glow. Outside, the night pressed against the glass like an eavesdropper, the city's lights smearing themselves across the puddles of the street. He signaled the bartender, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, who poured him a mug of beer from the tap. Larry traced the rim of the glass with his thumb, half listening to the muffled chatter of a few late-night patrons scattered along the booths behind him. A squeaking air conditioner in the corner competed with a muted TV, where a local news anchor spoke in monotone about a city council meeting. Larry didn't catch the details. He was too wrapped up in the swirling burdens of his own mind. This place was supposed to be a haven, at least for a few minutes. He needed a respite from the creeping hostility he felt in every corner of the city nowadays. Overhead lights hummed, intensifying the diner's sense of isolation from the outside world. Forks clinked against plates in the background. A waitress with a name tag reading Clara refilled coffee cups for a trio of bleary-eyed truckers at a corner booth. Now and again, the front door opened and a new swirl of humid night air drifted in, along with the faint reek of asphalt and car exhaust. The place smelled of bacon grease and faint disinfectant, an oddly comforting aroma that reminded Larry of simpler times, long before the city's moral compass started slipping. He let out a slow breath and tried to enjoy the mild bitterness of his beer. He was halfway through his drink, elbows propped on the counter, when the night's atmosphere shifted in an instant. A high, sharp crack, a gunshot, shattered the lazy hush inside the diner. For half a second, no one moved. Larry felt the sound burrow into his eardrums, a piercing thunderclap that jarred him more than any argument or outburst he'd witnessed in court. Instinct propelled him off his stool. The bartender dropped the glass he'd been cleaning, and it shattered on the floor. "Jesus," someone muttered. Another patron scrambled to the window, peering out into the darkness. Larry's heart thudded. He hadn't heard multiple shots, just one, but that single explosion was enough to kick his senses into overdrive. Without thinking, he sprinted to the entrance, pushing past the heavy glass door with enough force that it banged against its hinges. The neon sign overhead buzzed ominously, painting him in pink luminescence as he stepped onto the sidewalk. A hush clung to the street, the usual night sounds abruptly stifled. No passing cars at that moment, no idle chatter. Farther down the block, under a dim street lamp, Larry spotted a figure crumpled on the pavement. A tight coil of dread sprang to life in his stomach. He rushed forward, ignoring the flickering shadows cast by the lamp's dying fluorescent bulb. Drawing closer, he made out a small shape, barely more than a kid, maybe 15 or 16, wearing baggy jeans and a jacket too large for his slight frame. The teenager lay face up. Even in the meager light, Larry saw the dark patch of blood staining the boy's shirt near his abdomen. A watch, silver and glinting under the street lamp, sat askew on one wrist, the band half torn. Larry's mind went blank with a single directive: help him. Kneeling on the asphalt, he felt the boy's skin, clammy and cold to the touch. A metallic tang of fresh blood mingled with the stench of garbage from a nearby alley. The city's usual cocktail of odors, exhaust fumes and concrete, took on an acrid edge. "Hey," Larry said, voice trembling with urgency. "Kid, stay awake, okay? Hang in there." The boy's eyes fluttered, rolling back slightly as he coughed, spattering blood on his lips. His watch, jostled loose, fell onto the pavement with a muffled clink. Larry pressed his hands against the wound, hoping to stem the bleeding. The boy gasped, his chest rattling with each shallow breath. The diner's interior lights spilled out from behind Larry, and he heard distant voices, maybe the other patrons gathering at the door, unsure whether to come out. He yanked his phone from his pocket, thumb fumbling over the screen as he dialed 911. The ring seemed to last an eternity. All the while, the boy's heartbeat thrummed erratically beneath Larry's trembling hands. When the operator's voice clicked on, Larry wasted no time. "I have a teenage boy here, shot in the stomach," he said, forcing calm into his tone. "He's losing blood fast. I need an ambulance right away, on 10th and Laramie, near the neon-lit diner. Hurry." For a few seconds, the operator tapped at a keyboard, her breath audible in the headset. The typical questions began. "Your name? Condition of the victim?" Larry answered quickly, glancing at the boy's pale face, noting his shallow gasps. Every second counted. Yet then the operator's line of inquiry twisted in a way that struck Larry as incomprehensible. "Do you know if the victim provoked the shooter?" she asked flatly, as though it were standard protocol to question a mortally wounded teenager's possible role in his own assault. "Was he wearing anything expensive that might have invited theft?" Larry froze, heart pounding. He blinked, certain he'd misheard. "What? That doesn't matter right now," he stammered. "He's dying. You need to send help." The operator's voice droned on, mechanical, almost unconcerned. "Sir, it's important we understand the context. We're tasked with ensuring resources go where they're most needed. If he was, say, wearing something that made him a target, like a flashy watch, some might argue he should have exercised caution. Was he asking for it by wearing something valuable?" A rush of anger flared inside Larry's chest, momentarily overriding his shock. "He's a kid, gut shot in the street," he snapped. "Does that sound like he asked for it? Stop with the questions and send an ambulance." His voice pitched louder than he intended, echoing off the silent storefronts. Behind him, the diner's neon sign crackled, adding a surreal quality to the conversation. There was a pause on the line, the operator's breathing faintly audible. "I'll dispatch a unit," she finally said, her tone laced with a hint of impatience. "But it might be delayed. We have to confirm there was no provocation on the victim's part." Larry was about to yell again, but the call ended with a sterile beep. Numbness spread through his arms, not from cold, but from utter disbelief. The boy moaned softly, eyes rolling. Larry tried to refocus on the immediate crisis. "Hang on," he whispered, pressing down harder on the wound. The thick, warm blood seeped through his fingers, and a wave of nausea hit him. He'd seen crime scene photos, dealt with his share of forensic evidence, but never had he felt someone's life draining out under his own palms. A minute might have passed, or maybe 5. Time blurred as he knelt there, shivering despite the warm night air. Tires squealed at the far end of the block, and he looked up with desperate hope. Maybe help was arriving faster than the operator implied. Instead, an old sedan sped off into the darkness, leaving only the echo of its engine. The boy let out a ragged breath, and Larry sensed the tension leaving the young body in a ghastly wave. The boy's eyes, once fluttering, now fixed on Larry with a distant, unfocused stare. A stutter in his final breath, then stillness. "No," Larry murmured, voice cracking. He checked for a pulse along the kid's neck. Nothing. He watched the boy's chest for any sign of movement, heart pounding in his own ears. Silence. The hush that followed felt like a funeral shroud. Warm blood slicked Larry's hands, and he tried again, pressing trembling fingers against the lifeless neck. A sob stuck in his throat. Behind him, a cluster of gawkers had begun to gather, some from the diner, others drawn from the nearby street. They formed a hesitant semicircle, as though the boy's body exuded a force field they couldn't cross. The neon sign from the diner cast them all in a macabre pink glow, so that they looked more like silhouettes in a surreal painting than real people. Nobody spoke. A few turned away when they saw the child's vacant gaze. At last, Larry heard the distant wail of sirens. He lifted his head, hope flaring once more, but the desperation remained. The boy's final breath had already been taken. The swirling red and blue lights cut across the storefronts, momentarily painting them in shifting stripes of color. A police cruiser pulled up first, followed by an ambulance that screeched to a halt. Uniformed officers hopped out. They converged on the scene, scanning the pavement. One cop, a lanky man with a nightstick at his belt, signaled the paramedics to hang back. Larry stood shakily, blood drying on his hands like some grotesque glove. "He's gone," he managed, voice hoarse. "Shot in the stomach. I did what I could." The officer squinted at Larry and nodded briskly. "Step aside, sir. We'll handle this." He motioned for his partner, who knelt to examine the body. Another cop, round-faced with a mustache, pulled out a flashlight and began scanning the ground around the boy. Larry expected them to ask who might have shot the kid, or whether anyone saw the suspect. Instead, the mustachioed officer's first question was chillingly off-kilter. "So, any sign that the kid was trying to provoke someone? Flashing that watch around, maybe?" Larry's jaw dropped. He stared at the policeman's impassive face, noticing how the neon glow made the mustache look absurdly pink. "He's a teenager who was shot in the street," Larry said slowly, anger and shock warring in his voice. "We should be looking for the shooter, not trying to figure out if the victim deserved it." The mustachioed officer shrugged. "Hey, calm down. We're just trying to understand what happened. If he was flaunting something, it might give us context." He turned to the paramedics, who were arriving with a stretcher, though their faces also bore a resigned weariness that implied they knew it was already too late. "But he's a kid," Larry repeated, as though that fact alone should end any speculation. "You're suggesting he provoked the shooter by wearing a watch?" The watch, lying a foot away from the boy's outstretched hand, caught the cop's flashlight beam. It wasn't even particularly opulent, a standard silver band with a simple face, but evidently enough to be labeled provocation. Another officer joined them, flipping open a notepad. His tone was businesslike, but not outraged. "Any ID on the body?" He nudged the boy's jacket aside, rummaging through pockets. The casualness of the gesture, the lack of any reverence for the fact that a life had just been snuffed out, made Larry's stomach roil. The rummaging produced a battered wallet with a school ID, some crumpled bills, and a couple of receipts. One of the cops read the ID under the flashlight's glare. "Name's Terrence Logan, 15, lives on the west side." He stowed the ID back in the wallet before leaning over the watch. He picked it up, turned it over. "That's a decent brand. Could fetch a bit of money. Wonder if he was bragging about it?" Larry had to fight the urge to shout at them, to demand they show an ounce of humanity. Instead, He looked on in horrified silence as they bagged the watch like it was the smoking gun and turned their attention to combing the boy's pockets for evidence. The paramedics had moved aside, waiting for instructions to load the body, but nobody seemed in a hurry. A cluster of onlookers at the perimeter snapped pictures on their phones. A few murmured to each other, but no one openly condemned the line of questioning. It was as though the entire world had quietly agreed that the best approach was to see how the victim might have contributed to his own fate. One paramedic stepped closer to Larry, noticing the blood on his hands. "Sir, are you hurt?" she asked, voice gentler than that of the officers. Her eyes flicked to the dark stains on his shirt cuffs. Larry shook his head. "No, I tried to help him, but it was too late." He felt his throat constrict. "He was still alive when I called 911. I told them it was an emergency, but the operator—" He stopped, unsure how to articulate the sheer absurdity of the question he'd been asked. She asked if he provoked it by wearing something expensive, like he was to blame for being shot. The paramedic's sympathetic expression faltered. She glanced over at the cops. "It's become, well, you know," she said softly, as though that explained everything. Her eyes held a mix of pity and resignation, as if she'd seen too many scenes like this already. Too many times the victim was accused of inviting violence. "I'm sorry," she added, and Larry realized she wasn't just apologizing for the boy's death, but for the entire moral madness swirling around them. Behind them, the officers had concluded that there was no immediate threat at the scene, no sign of the shooter lurking in the shadows. A detective's sedan pulled up, lights pulsing. The detective, a woman with a tight bun and sharp features, slid out. She took stock of the dead teenager, the watch, and Larry's expression of dismay. In any normal time, Larry might have expected a detective to question him about the killer, the direction of the gunshot, possible suspects. Instead, she knelt next to the body, checked the pockets again, then rose with an air of clinical detachment. "Happens more often than you'd think," she said, as if that were some kind of comfort. "Got to be careful out here, especially wearing nice things. Was he dealing with any gang or personal grudges that you know of, sir?" Larry shook his head, at a loss. "I don't even know him," he managed, voice hollow. He was just a kid. I ran outside when I heard the shot, that's all." The detective nodded curtly. "We'll do what we can," she said, without an ounce of genuine conviction. As if concluding there was nothing more to glean, she gestured for the paramedics to remove the body. A black bag was unzipped, and they lifted the slender form into it with minimal fuss. The zipper rasped closed, sealing away Terrence Logan's final expression, some mixture of confusion and agony that no 15-year-old should ever wear. Larry felt the corners of his vision blur. He realized with detached horror that tears were burning behind his eyes. This was a child, victimized by a random bullet to get hold of a watch, or maybe for no reason at all. Yet every authority on scene seemed more concerned with whether the boy had invited the violence. The finality of it sank in as the paramedics loaded the bag onto a gurney, rolling it toward the ambulance. The night's quiet returned, but it was far from peaceful. A drizzle began to fall, light at first, droplets pattering on the asphalt. The neon diner sign stuttered again, reflecting off the forming puddles so that the whole street glowed an eerie shade of pink. Larry looked down at his hands, blood drying in uneven patches across his palms, smeared up to his wrists. As the raindrops struck his skin, tiny rivers of diluted crimson ran toward the gutter. The slow beat of sirens faded as the ambulance pulled away, lights receding into the distance. The police stayed behind, shining flashlights on the ground, presumably searching for a shell casing or any shred of evidence that might point to the shooter. But their conversation, as Larry overheard in fragments, hinged on whether the boy was hanging out in the wrong place. Over and over, they repeated lines like, "Should have been more careful, could have just stayed home." The condemnation was directed at the kid who lay dead, not the unknown gunman. A dark wave of despair crashed into Larry's chest. This was no isolated incident. It was a microcosm of a world turned cruelly upside down. Over the past few weeks, he'd seen how empathy had been withering away, replaced by a reflex to blame the defenseless whenever they suffered. But to hear it expressed so blatantly, to witness it at such a raw moment, when a child had just died, felt like stepping into a nightmare from which there was no waking. He backed away, ignoring the half-formed questions from an officer who noticed him stepping aside. The rain intensified, soaking through his shirt. He looked to the sky, dark clouds swirling overhead, occasionally lit by the city's glow below. The neon sign from the diner behind him sizzled more audibly, as if on the verge of shorting out. The pink reflection on the wet pavement turned the water near the boy's blood slick into a surreal tapestry of swirling color, tinted red, pink, and black. All the while, onlookers dispersed. Some retreated into the diner, huddling at the counter or booths, eager to reclaim their evening. Others slunk away down the street, heads ducked, as though wanting to put as much distance as possible between themselves and this tragedy. No one confronted the police's approach. No one shouted, "Find the killer," or "This was murder." Instead, they avoided each other's eyes, muttered about how the city was going downhill, and let the unstoppable blame game spool out, unstoppable as an oil slick. Larry found himself standing in the middle of the street, arms hanging limp. Raindrops clung to his lashes. The sight of his reflection, watery and pink-tinged in a forming puddle, felt distant and unrecognizable. This wasn't the city he'd once believed in, where at least the fundamental notion of justice was shared by the majority. Something had snapped, some moral thread that people had held onto. One of the officers gestured for the detective to approach. Their low conversation carried on the damp wind. "He's just another dumb kid who should have known better wearing that watch. We'll file the usual report." The detective nodded, flipping her notebook closed. Larry's stomach turned. Not a word about searching for the suspect. Not a mention of how to stop further violence. Only the quiet acceptance that the victim had walked straight into this outcome. Another wave of nausea struck him. He bent over, pressing a hand to his mouth, fighting the urge to vomit. The bitterness of his beer churned in his gut, clashing with the rancid smell of blood and rain. Scenes from past cases flickered in his mind. He'd prosecuted criminals who'd robbed, assaulted, and killed. Usually the public had been outraged on behalf of victims, at least in principle. But now, the city's hearts seemed to have calcified. Instead of mourning Terrence Logan, people demanded an explanation for why he had been so careless. Rising unsteadily, Larry looked at the stained pavement one last time. Rain sluiced away some of the blood, carrying it down a gutter that gurgled underfoot. The bright pink glow of the diner sign glistened in the puddles, a sick parody of comfort in a world that had grown unfeeling. He realized he couldn't stay here a second longer. The silent condemnation radiating from those indifferent stares, from the scornful police chatter, from the neon gloom, it all pressed on him with suffocating force. He turned toward the diner, stepping over the scattered shards of broken glass from inside, the door still propped open. A huddle of patrons parted as he passed, their eyes flicking to his blood-stained clothing, then away again. Some of them seemed vaguely sympathetic. Others looked inconvenienced by the interruption to their late-night meal. He wanted to wash his hands, but a deeper dread told him the stain clinging to them went beyond soap and water. He was witnessing the city's moral decay in real time, and no matter how thoroughly he might rinse his skin, the imprint of that realization wouldn't fade. Exiting the diner without a word, he stepped back into the rain. His car was parked a block down, beneath a flickering street lamp. Each footstep splashed in shallow puddles, the water mixing with the dried streaks on his shoes. He reached his vehicle, fumbling for his keys, still reeling from the simple fact that he had listened to a 911 operator question whether a child had asked to be shot. That police on the scene rummaged for provocation in the boy's pockets. That no one seemed eager to bring the shooter to justice. He collapsed into the driver's seat, inhaling the faint stale air of the car's interior. The rain drummed on the windshield, a relentless percussion that matched the pounding in his chest. He stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror, eyes bloodshot, face pale as a ghost. The day's horrors caught up to him all at once, a deluge of regrets and shock. He couldn't muster the strength to drive away just yet. Instead, he watched rivulets of water snake down the glass, shimmering under the flickering street lamp. Headlights of passing cars occasionally splashed across the windshield, but no one lingered. No one stopped. The sirens from earlier had receded entirely, replaced by the watery hush of rainfall. Larry dropped his head against the steering wheel, exhaling a tremulous breath. This city, he thought, used to have a beating heart. Or at least he'd believed it did. Now it felt unrecognizable, a place where a dying kid in the street was interrogated by proxy, deemed possibly at fault for his own murder. Where the watchers asked not, "Why did this happen?" but, "What did he do to deserve it?" His hands shook on the wheel, the blood flaking and coming off in tiny flakes that dotted the steering column. He remembered the boy's last gasp, the shock in those young eyes. The sense that he hadn't expected death to come so swiftly, or maybe at all. That final look of betrayal, as if the world itself had turned on him. Larry closed his eyes, grief crashing over him like a tidal wave. He wanted to scream, to rage at the heavens, to condemn every twisted justification he'd heard. But exhaustion crumpled him, leaving only a mute desolation. Minutes passed, or was it hours? The city's lights blurred in the downpour, each drop reflecting neon or halogen shimmer. At some point, Larry lifted his head, blinking through the watery haze. He turned the key, and the engine coughed to life. He flicked on the wipers, watching them smear the windshield in rhythmic arcs. The boy's name, Terrence Logan, echoed in his thoughts, a ghostly refrain that reminded him of the cost of turning a blind eye to cruelty. He pulled away from the curb slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror at the spot where the teen had lain, though the scene was now shrouded by sheets of rain. No shape on the ground, no trace of the red stain. Perhaps the memory was all that remained. The diner's pink glow receded into the backdrop of the city, leaving behind only a hollow sense of dread for what might come next. If no one would stand for a wounded teenager, who else would be left to fend for themselves in these streets? As he turned a corner, the wail of a distant siren briefly cut through the storm, then vanished. Larry drove on, each street he passed seeming more desolate. Darkened storefronts lined the way, windows reflecting empty sidewalks. The rainfall intensified, drumming a relentless tattoo on the roof, as if the sky itself wept for the lost boy. Larry's mind drifted back to the operator's words. Was he asking for it by wearing something valuable? And bile rose in his throat. That a question so callous could be uttered in the face of a child's dying breaths was a testament to how warped society had become. By the time he reached the freeway on-ramp, the night had grown even darker, the rain forging rivers along the gutters. The rhythmic whoosh of the wipers became a hypnotic beat. He felt as though he were navigating not just empty streets, but a moral wasteland too. The city he had once believed in was nowhere to be found. In its place stood a realm where the question was no longer who harmed whom, but who provoked it. A place where a shooting victim's final moments were overshadowed by an interrogation of his choices. Where the need for accountability had been twisted into condemnation of the powerless. Larry set his jaw, forcing his attention back to the road. Each mile marker he passed left him with the bitter truth that the city's rotting conscience would follow him wherever he went. He'd seen enough this night to understand that a deeper shift was underway. A malignant transformation of empathy into scorn, of justice into suspicion. It wasn't just one operator or a handful of jaded cops. It was a culture now, a collective shrug at every tragedy, content to blame the victim if it meant avoiding the reckoning of genuine moral responsibility. Somewhere behind him, hidden by walls of rain and skyscrapers, a set of parents would soon learn they'd lost a child. A watch, likely the boy's only keepsake of any value, would become a central argument in a twisted narrative of self-inflicted tragedy. And a diner's neon sign would keep buzzing, reflecting pink on the wet street, unchanging despite the horrific event that had unfolded mere steps away. The thought hollowed Larry's chest. He pressed on the accelerator, guiding his car toward whatever shelter awaited him. He understood there would be no sleep for him tonight. The metallic taste of the boy's blood still lingered in his senses, the memory etched into his hands and mind. Rain drenched the city, but it couldn't cleanse what he had witnessed. No amount of rinsing would wash away the creeping realization that compassion and accountability had become relics in the place he called home. At last, he merged onto a quiet stretch of road where the streetlights were spaced far apart. The gloom deepened. Each passing lamp illuminated the storm-blurred road for an instant, then vanished. As the wipers struggled to keep pace with the downpour, Larry envisioned the dark, lifeless eyes of Terrence Logan locked forever on that indifferent sky. He let out a ragged breath, forging on through the swirling night, knowing that after what he had seen, the city he was returning to would never look the same. The stench of blame and cruelty haunted him, and with every mile, the unrelenting storm hammered home the sickening truth. In this new era of callousness, innocence was a liability, empathy a relic, and death just another story of who had asked for it. Part 7. The Twist of the Gavel. Larry Stone arrived at the courthouse before dawn, unable to sleep. A gray haze hovered in the sky, dimming the early morning light that typically bathed the grand marble steps out front. Instead of the usual bustle, the building seemed to exist in a pocket of eerie calm. Reporters were already scattered across the plaza, forming small huddles by the pillars and around camera tripods. They spoke in hushed tones and sipped from paper cups of coffee, as if bracing themselves for a storm. Today was the final day of the Dan Scruggs trial, and the entire city waited with collective tension to see how it would end. Larry's footsteps echoed as he moved down the long corridor inside. Every detail seemed amplified: the squeak of his shoes on the polished floor, the dull fluorescent lights overhead. He headed for the prosecutor's conference room, where he had prepared so many times before. Now his notes lay in neat stacks, a tidy but hollow reflection of months of work. The entire case, built on DNA evidence, eyewitness accounts, and the testimonies of multiple victims, should have been beyond reproach. Yet in recent weeks, Larry had sensed a shift in the tide, a subtle but palpable resentment against the victims themselves. It defied all logic, but logic no longer felt like the currency of this trial. He dropped his briefcase on the table, flipping the latch open. Inside, files labeled with color-coded tabs stared back at him. He was ready to refute any last-minute defense claims, to point again to the indisputable facts. But a knot in his stomach told him that facts weren't going to matter anymore. Over the past days, the jurors' expressions had grown increasingly detached whenever the prosecution spoke. They looked almost affronted that Sally Shields and the other women had come forward at all. Still, Larry clung to a shred of hope. Maybe the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. Maybe the justice system had not rotted beyond repair. He stood in the silent room for a moment, inhaling deeply, trying to settle the tremors in his chest. Then, with a long exhalation, he gathered his papers and headed toward the courtroom. As soon as he stepped through the doors, the tension struck him like a physical force. The spectator seats were packed, row after row of faces wearing grim expectancy. Media representatives filled the back benches, cameras perched on shoulders, telephoto lenses protruding like predatory beaks. A low murmur rippled through them as they recognized Larry, but no one shouted questions. They were waiting for the real spectacle, the verdict. He took his seat at the prosecution's table, scanning the room. Judge Rutledge had not yet emerged from chambers. The defense team sat on the opposite side, talking in whispers with Dan Scruggs, whose relaxed posture set Larry's teeth on edge. Scruggs appeared remarkably confident for a man facing multiple counts of sexual assault. He wore a tailored suit with an air of flippancy that clashed with the severity of the accusations against him. Now and again, he exchanged smiles with the defense attorney. It was as though the entire trial had been a formality, a brief inconvenience before he could step back into the world and shrug off all accountability. Nearby, a protective officer led Sally Shields into the courtroom. She looked pale, eyes ringed with exhaustion. She'd testified tirelessly, laying bare the most traumatic details of her experience: torn clothing, menacing threats, bruises as proof. The weight of it all had left her trembling on the stand. Yet that raw honesty had somehow been twisted by the defense. Even worse, a significant portion of the spectators, and possibly some of the jurors, seemed to consider her push for justice to be an overreaction. Seeing her now, Larry felt a pang of guilt, as if he should have shielded her from the venom that had seeped into the case. Sally's gaze flitted to Larry, and she offered a wavering smile. He returned it, though it felt hollow. "We'll see this through," he said softly, not sure whether she heard him over the courtroom's low hum. She took a seat in the front row, accompanied by a friend who squeezed her hand in silent support. A bailiff stepped forward, tapping the base of his baton on the floor. "All rise," he said, and the crowd rose as one. Judge Rutledge emerged, black robes rustling. He settled behind the bench with deliberate care, face unreadable. For a moment, an absolute hush fell over the room, a hush so profound that Larry could hear his own heartbeat thudding. Today was the day that would seal Dan Scrubbs's fate, and, Larry feared, something far larger than a single man's outcome. The judge motioned for everyone to be seated. "I understand the jury has reached a verdict," he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. A deputy led the jurors in, and they filed into the box with solemn expressions. Larry's pulse quickened, scanning for any hint. Some jurors looked stoic, others borderline defiant. One juror kept his gaze fixed on the floor as though ashamed. Another wore a faint smirk. A middle-aged woman, the jury foreperson, rose, a slip of paper in her hand. She held it so tightly that Larry expected it might tear. The entire courtroom seemed to brace. Cameras clicked, flashes erupted at the edges of the gallery. Larry closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, summoning any last vestige of confidence that reason would prevail. "We, the jury," began the foreperson, voice quivering slightly. "In the case of the People versus Dan Scrubbs, on the counts of sexual assault as charged, find the defendant." She paused, exhaling shakily. "Not guilty." A seismic jolt tore through the room. Gasps, disbelieving murmurs, even a few stifled laughs of surprise. Larry's mouth fell open. He knew the system could fail, but the evidence in this case had been overwhelming. His mind reeled with the mountain of forensic analyses, the witness testimonies, and Sally's gut-wrenching account. Yet the jury had chosen to disregard it all. At the defense table, Dan Scrubbs shot a triumphant grin across the courtroom. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, cameras whirring. A tide of chatter swept the gallery. Larry struggled to keep his composure, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. His thoughts scattered. How could this happen? He glanced at Sally, whose face was etched in total shock. Tears began to roll down her cheeks, but a kind of frozen disbelief held her otherwise motionless. Judge Rutledge raised a gavel, rapping it once, calling for order. The bailiff barked for silence. The jury foreperson, still standing, cleared her throat. "We have, however, addressed the matter of the victim's conduct in pursuing charges." Larry felt his pulse spike again, unsure what to make of that statement. The woman continued, her tone subdued yet resolute. "It is the consensus of this jury that the victims, especially Sally Shields, adopted an excessively combative stance in demanding legal recourse, thus provoking the alleged offender to further distress. Therefore, we have also deliberated on countercharges aimed at Ms. Shields." A second thunderbolt. Larry's breath caught as the verdict continued. "Ms. Shields is hereby—" The foreperson's voice trembled, but she pressed on. "Sentenced to 5 years incarceration for provocation of the defendant, Dan Scrubbs." The words rang out, filling the courtroom with a stunned hush. Cameras exploded into a frenzy of flashes. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as if reality had warped. Larry stared at the foreperson, convinced he must have misheard. Then the full weight of her statement registered. They weren't just letting Dan Scrubbs walk free. They were punishing Sally for daring to speak out. A clamor rose throughout the gallery. Some onlookers erupted into outraged exclamations, while others looked grimly satisfied, as though justice had been served in their twisted perspective. Reporters jockeyed for position, lenses snapping. Microphones extended like feeding tubes toward the lawyers, the judge, anyone who might deliver a soundbite. The flashbulb strobed so frantically that it felt like the entire room was under a storm of relentless lightning. Sally Shields let out a ragged cry that cut through the commotion. "No, this can't be," she sobbed, half rising before the guard at her side placed a firm hand on her shoulder. Her expression was that of someone betrayed by the universe itself. She tried to form words, but only broken syllables emerged. "I did nothing wrong. I was hurt. Larry felt a surge of outrage so intense it rattled his own composure. He sprang to his feet, ignoring the swirl of cameras. "Your Honor," he began, voice shaking with fury. "This is a miscarriage of justice. There is absolutely no basis, none, for sentencing Ms. Shields to any prison time. She's the victim here, not the offender." Judge Rutledge looked momentarily stricken, but he quickly hid it behind a veneer of stoicism. "Order, Mr. Stone," he said, rapping the gavel. "The jury has spoken. This courtroom must maintain decorum." Larry could scarcely believe his ears. But there's no legal precedent for punishing a victim for pursuing charges. This trial, this verdict, it flies in the face of everything the law stands for. His voice rose, echoing in the stunned hush. "We need a mistrial, or an immediate appeal. Something—" The judge's eyes flicked nervously to the press, to the throng of people capturing every second. Then, with a firm crack, he brought down the gavel again. "Court is adjourned. Take Miss Shields into custody." The word adjourned reverberated like a death knell. It was all so abrupt, so final, that Larry might have thought it a sick joke if he weren't living it in real time. A wave of pandemonium erupted as the bailiffs closed in on Sally. She was half sobbing, half pleading with the officers not to cuff her, stumbling over her words. Cameras pressed in, capturing her tear-streaked face. One reporter, leaning over the wooden barrier that separated the gallery from the well of the courtroom, shouted, "Sally, how does it feel to be on the wrong side of the law now?" Another demanded, "Do you regret taking this to trial?" The cruelty in their questions took Larry's breath away. He moved toward Sally, arms extended as if to shield her from the relentless glare and jeering. "Stop it," he barked at the cluster of cameras. "She's done nothing wrong." The bailiffs forced him aside, though they didn't shove him. Perhaps they recognized that he was the prosecutor and still deserved a measure of respect. But that respect didn't extend to letting him stand between Sally and her handcuffs. Within seconds, her wrists were shackled, the metal clinking into place. That sound was like the final snap of the trap. Sally let out a wail, eyes darting around as if searching for an explanation in the sea of faces. Larry forced his way through the swirl of media, ignoring the barrage of camera flashes, ignoring the outstretched microphones. He reached Sally, trembling with rage and sorrow. Her face was blotched with tears, her posture hunched in despair. All he managed to do was lay a comforting hand on her shoulder before the officers pulled her forward. "Sally," he whispered, voice choked. "I'm so sorry." He had no other words that could encapsulate the avalanche of injustice burying them both. She stared at him, eyes wide and anguished, as a bailiff tried to guide her out of the courtroom. The glare of flash photography played across her tear-stained cheeks, capturing the moment of her downfall. A swirl of arms, uniforms, and cameras coalesced around them, burying her in a living avalanche of press. Meanwhile, at the defense table, Dan Scrubs calmly collected his belongings. He cast a smirk in Larry's direction, as though to say, "Better luck next time." Larry wanted to lunge at him, to rail about the travesty of the system. But the walls were closing in, reporters and onlookers forming a living barrier that made every step a struggle. The judge had vanished from the bench the instant he slammed the gavel, leaving the entire courtroom to unravel. A group of spectators at the back openly applauded the verdict. One woman shouted, "She got what she deserved," while her companion grinned in agreement. The entire display was more reminiscent of a lynch mob's jubilation than a court of law. Stunned, Larry realized there were no longer moral pillars holding up this room. Every oath, every principle of the legal process seemed to have collapsed in an instant. He caught a snippet of conversation from a pair of journalists elbowing their way to the front. "This is gold. Our ratings will skyrocket with a victim-turned-inmate." Yeah, people love a new spin, from righteous accuser to convicted antagonist. The cynicism of it twisted Larry's stomach. He tried to push through the throng, but Sally was already being led away through a side door, flanked by two bailiffs. Her sobs echoed off the walls, a heartbreaking dirge for anyone who still had a shred of conscience. He could barely catch a glimpse of her face as she disappeared around the corner, her eyes pleading, raw with betrayal. For a moment, time seemed to warp. The crowd's noise became a roar in Larry's ears, and the overhead fluorescents took on a harsh glare that made him feel dizzy. He fought to steady himself, clutching the back of a wooden bench to keep upright. The notion that this was all real, no feverish nightmare, no hyperbolic rumor, nearly buckled his knees. Dan Scrubs, a man stacked with incriminating evidence against him, was strolling out of court, a free man. Sally Shields, the bravest of the victims, was about to be transported to prison for having the audacity to demand justice. Cameras continued to snap away, capturing every nuance of the meltdown. Voices reverberated from all directions. "Larry Stone, Do you plan to appeal? Is this the end of victims' rights as we know it? Can you give us a statement on the fairness of the trial? Larry's mouth felt too dry for words. He swallowed, ignoring the microphone thrust near his face, ignoring the bright glare of a news crew's spotlight. Finally, he mustered a grim response, though it was more of an anguished exhale than a coherent statement. There is no justice here. A hush fell momentarily, as if the crowd wanted to see if he'd elaborate. But he had nothing more to say. He turned, stepping back to the prosecutor's table, collecting his files with shaky hands. The official transcripts, the evidence binders, they all felt like meaningless props in a twisted play. A bailiff approached, expression tinged with pity. "I'm sorry, Mr. Stone. He trailed off, glancing at the reporters pushing in from behind. Larry nodded, not trusting his voice. He stuffed everything into his briefcase. On the other side of the courtroom, Dan Scrubs shook hands with his defense attorney, who grinned from ear to ear. Scrubs then paused to give an interview to a gaggle of reporters. "I'm thankful the system worked," he said, voice oozing triumph. "The jury saw that the real criminal was the one trying to defame me." The cameras ate up every word. Sickened, Larry pushed his way through the throng, searching for a path to the door Sally had taken. Perhaps he could speak to her before they carted her off in a van to county lockup. The corridor was jammed with more media, their voices overlapping in excited chatter about the sensational twist. Court staff tried in vain to keep them from blocking the hall. Larry pressed on, but by the time he reached the double doors leading to the detention area, he was met by a bailiff who shook his head, motioning him back. "She's gone," the officer said gently. They moved fast. Once the judge slammed that gavel, the order was final. They hustled her right out. Larry's chest tightened. He imagined Sally being marched down the fluorescent-lit corridors, the clang of metal doors echoing, her tears unstoppable. He envisioned her stepping into a prison cell for the crime of pursuing justice, the clang of the gate behind her sealing in the most barbaric betrayal he'd ever witnessed in a courtroom. He sank against the wall, ignoring the swirl of voices and footsteps around him. Eventually, reporters discovered him there, recording every nuance of his despair. Some shouted more questions, but he was numb. He could only watch as they streamed past, chasing fresh angles. An interview with a smug defense team, perhaps, or a shot of an empty courtroom that had become ground zero for the day's headline. A slow exodus of spectators followed. Many wore stunned expressions, as if they too couldn't reconcile the verdict with the evidence they'd witnessed. Others wore smug grins. A few intentionally avoided meeting Larry's eyes. He glimpsed a handful of Sally's supporters, presumably the other victims who'd testified, huddled near the exit in tears. One of them spotted him and mouthed, "How?" He had no answer. The overhead lights flickered as a custodian moved around, picking up stray papers and crumpled tissues left behind. The day, for everyone else, was done. For Larry, it felt like the entire world had collapsed. He took shaky steps back into the courtroom, which was quickly emptying out. The bright press lights dimmed as the last of the cameras withdrew, like predators satisfied with their footage. Standing near the defense table, Dan Scrubs gave him a final, mocking wave before swaggering out the door, a free man in every sense. No handcuffs, no sentencing, not even a fine. He'd walk back into society unscathed, validated by a jury that found fault not in his alleged assaults, but in the victim's pursuit of accountability. Larry glanced at the bench. Judge Rutledge's seat was vacant, the gavel still resting on the wooden surface like a silent executioner's tool. In that object's polished reflection, he saw the reflection of a shattered moral framework. The once sacred illusions of fairness, justice, and empathy in a court of law now felt like relics from a bygone era. A wave of nausea swept over him, and he had to brace himself against the prosecution's table to keep from collapsing. Outside, he heard the echo of the final crowd dispersing, the heavy doors of the courthouse opening and closing. The media would be broadcasting their stories soon. Headlines, interviews, sensational lines about how the city's justice system had turned on a victim. But none of that would remedy the fact that Sally was gone, hauled off to prison for daring to speak out. The injustice of it landed like a physical blow in Larry's gut. In the hush of the now empty courtroom, he stood paralyzed, replaying every second of what had just happened. The relentless flash of cameras, The scornful gazes, the bizarre verdict. The ultimate betrayal came in the form of that final gavel strike, which not only exonerated a likely predator, but also condemned the very person he'd traumatized. It felt like a twisted fable, an upside-down morality tale where the brave are punished and the cunning walk free. He closed his eyes, inhaling the stale air that carried the lingering smell of aftershave, cheap perfume, and the faint tension of so many bodies that had crowded in. He could still hear Sally's final sob, echoing in his mind like a ghostly requiem. The pounding of his heart gradually slowed, each beat a painful reminder of how powerless he'd been to stop this travesty. A last flash of movement caught his attention. A reporter who had lingered in the shadows, notebook in hand. She snapped one more photo, the click unnervingly loud in the hush. Then, her job done, she quietly slipped out. That left Larry truly alone in the silent chamber. Overhead, the fluorescent lights hummed, indifferent to the collapse that had just taken place. He didn't know how long he stood there, gripping the table as if it were the only solid thing in a world gone mad. Seconds, minutes, an hour. Time lost meaning. The roar of his own thoughts was deafening. Had everything he believed in, the sanctity of evidence, the impartial wisdom of a jury, been a delusion? The question hung in the air, merging with the echo of his earlier protests that now felt pathetically futile. At last, the bailiff reappeared, quietly clearing his throat. "Mr. Stone, we need to close up soon." His voice was gentle. "I'm sorry about everything." Larry lifted his gaze, tears he hadn't realized were there blurring the scene. He blinked them away. "Yeah," he said thickly, no strength left to argue or rage. He snapped his briefcase shut and walked stiffly toward the exit. Each footstep over the worn carpet felt like a nail driven into the coffin of his convictions. Outside, the corridor was deserted, the watchers long gone. The overhead lights in the hallway glowed with a sterile pallor, lighting Larry's path to the building's main doors. He felt as though he were trudging through some catacomb of lost ideals, each step reverberating with the knowledge of how profoundly the system had failed. Passing the guard station, he offered a perfunctory nod to a security officer who looked back with sympathy, but said nothing. Stepping onto the courthouse steps, he found the sky overhead tinged with the pink hues of sunset. A light breeze tousled the trees lining the plaza. The day was nearly spent, and the spectacle was over. The press vans were mostly gone, leaving only a few parked cars and scraps of debris from the earlier throng. A single camera crew stood in the distance, filming a final segment, their voices too faint for Larry to decipher. He paused at the top of the steps, letting the wind cool his overheated face. The city's usual hum of traffic and distant sirens provided a bleak soundtrack. In that moment, he recalled the image of Sally in handcuffs, tears streaming, while Dan Scrubbs smirked his way to freedom. The memory clenched his heart. He couldn't reconcile it, couldn't fathom how the moral backbone of the courts had cracked so violently under pressure. Through the swirl of questions haunting him, one reality stood out. Everything had changed. The pillars of justice upon which he had built his career felt dismantled, leaving only disarray and cynicism. He longed to find Sally, to reassure her that they would appeal, that they would fight this injustice. But the thought of how many months, maybe years, that legal battle could take weighed on him like 1,000 pounds. And what kind of system would they be appealing within anyway, if today's verdict was considered legitimate? Slowly descending the steps, he tried to steady his thoughts. A swirl of conflicting emotions warred in his mind. Rage, despair, shame at having failed Sally, and a flicker of determination that this couldn't be the final word. Yet that resolve felt feeble amid the crushing sense of betrayal. His footsteps echoed on the concrete, each one a metronome of regret. He remembered how many times he'd believed in the system's capacity to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. Now, that trust lay in tatters at his feet. By the time he reached the sidewalk, the sun had dipped below the horizon. Streetlights flickered to life. He stood there, uncertain, scanning the quieting city. Above, clouds drifted lazily, as though oblivious to the moral collapse that had just occurred within these courthouse walls. Cars passed intermittently, their headlights sweeping across his hunched figure. No one paused to ask if he was all right. The city moved on as it always did, indifferent to the day's horror. In one last glance over his shoulder, Larry saw the courthouse, once a symbol of order and righteousness, now looming like a dark silhouette against the evening sky. The massive columns that used to inspire awe gave him only a sense of emptiness. He swallowed hard, half expecting to hear the echo of that final gavel strike. But silence reigned, a disquieting hush that confirmed the reality. Dan Scrubs was free, and Sally Shields was not only disbelieved, but condemned. He turned away from the imposing structure. His chest tightened, and tears threatened again. Where does one go when every pillar has crumbled? He had no ready answer. All he knew was that this day, with its twisted verdict, had shattered any lingering illusions that truth inherently triumphs in a court of law. If it ever did, it had died here, in a storm of camera flashes and a perverse applause for the punishing of a victim. With a heavy heart, Larry set off into the twilight. Each step felt like a testament to a new, darker era. He envisioned Sally behind bars, tears drying on her cheeks, the clang of a cell door finalizing the betrayal of justice. That image would haunt him for a long time, overshadowing every notion of fairness he had once cherished. And as he walked away, the courthouse lights flickered on behind him, illuminating an empty plaza, a stark memorial to the moment when the moral fabric of society, threadbare for some time, finally tore for all to see. Part 8. Flight to the Frontier. Larry Stone could still feel the echo of slamming doors reverberate through his chest as he and Sally burst into the open air, hearts pounding in unison. It was mere moments after court had adjourned. The corridor behind them still thrummed with frantic voices. Yet somehow, in a flurry of adrenaline and desperation, they had slipped through a side entrance unguarded. The heavy metal door thunked shut behind them, sealing off the shouts and clamor. Neither of them dared look back. A single glance at each other communicated the obvious. They had no choice but to run. Outside, the sky was a deep, moonless charcoal. The sprawling city bristled with fluorescent lights and the drone of traffic. But for a fleeting moment, Larry and Sally found themselves in a pocket of darkness between street lamps. They pressed close to a concrete wall, breath ragged, adrenaline screeching in their veins. A hush enveloped them, frayed only by the distant hum of police scanners or late-night radio chatter drifting from passing cars. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as though fearful of betraying their location. Sally grabbed Larry's arm, her eyes shining with urgent resolve. No words passed between them, but the quick nods they exchanged spoke volumes. They moved in sync, creeping along a loading dock, then ducking behind a dumpster that reeked of stale grease and rotting produce. A security guard's flashlight skittered through an adjacent alley, the beam cutting the darkness like a sword. But by some miracle, the light never landed on them. In seconds, they had merged into the labyrinth of the city's back streets, weaving around bins, hopping over chain-link fences, and darting through vacant lots. Every echo of footsteps, every squealing tire, sent pulses of fear through Larry's chest. The city that had once felt like a place he knew intimately had transformed into a menacing trap. Every corner a potential vantage point for watchers or vigilantes. Dark windows rose overhead, the silhouettes of office towers looming against the faint starlight. The wail of a distant siren jolted them forward, fueling an even more panicked sprint across a deserted intersection. They pressed themselves into a doorway as a pair of headlights swept past. The tension was excruciating, but they dared not relax. Even in these first minutes, the magnitude of their decision, fleeing rather than submitting, had anchored itself in their minds with terrifying weight. They maintained a low profile until they found an abandoned car near a crooked chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. In the hush of a derelict industrial zone, they tested the door handles. One vehicle was locked, the next immovable with a dead battery. But then Sally found an old sedan with the keys inexplicably in the ignition. Perhaps the owner had left it in haste, or maybe it was a junker nobody cared to steal. Either way, they whispered thanks to whatever gods might be listening and slid inside, the engine sputtering to life after a few nerve-rattling attempts. Larry took the wheel, glancing over at Sally, whose face gleamed with perspiration in the faint glow of the dashboard. They both knew how precarious this plan was. No plan at all, really. Just an instinct to drive until the city's bright lights were specks in the rearview mirror. He pulled onto the main road, heart hammering, eyes flicking constantly between the side mirror and the speedometer. Shadows flickered across the windshield from overhead billboards, each proclaiming some cheery advertisement that clashed hideously with their reality. Within minutes, the city's glowing skyscrapers receded behind them, and traffic thinned. Yet the tension coiled in Larry's stomach refused to subside. He half expected flashing lights and sirens at any moment, a blockade around the next bend. Occasionally, he'd reduce speed to avoid attracting attention, or slip onto side streets, using vague memories of old routes to keep them from major highways. Sally rummaged in the glove box, discovering only a few crumpled receipts and a ragged map from decades ago. No help there, but it felt better to do something. Anything. They drove for hours, the night stretching on like a merciless test of endurance. Whenever they stopped for gas, they'd pick remote stations, lonely outposts glowing under buzzing fluorescent lights. One of them would hurry inside to pay in cash, while the other watched the horizon for suspicious vehicles. The attendants, bored and bleary-eyed, paid them little mind. Once or twice, a clerk eyed them curiously, but said nothing. The tension soared whenever a police car rolled by on the adjacent highway, but luck or providence kept them from being noticed. Gradually, the city's sprawling outskirts melted into a patchwork of rural roads. The neon arches and chain restaurants vanished behind them, replaced by silent farmland, occasional ranch-style homes, and fields stretching out in the pale starlight. By the time the horizon began to shift from jet black to a subtle navy, hinting at dawn, they found themselves near the edge of a wooded region. Larry pulled over onto a dirt shoulder, killed the lights, and cut the engine. They sat for a moment, breathing in the pine-scented air that drifted through the open windows. Their bodies ached from tension, and the reality of what they'd done flooded in with the gentle promise of the coming day. Sally leaned her head against the seat, eyes half-lidded. "What now?" she asked softly, voice trembling not with fear, but with the exhaustion of recent ordeals. Larry ran a hand over his stubbled chin, gazing at the faint outlines of towering pines. "We keep going," he murmured, "until we're off every map." It was a grim declaration, but also laced with a flicker of hope. He started the engine again, turning onto a winding back road that led, according to a battered sign, toward Colorado. Though Colorado lay many miles ahead, the promise of mountains and anonymity beckoned like a silent beacon. They continued in shifting patterns of rest and movement, driving through the night, catnapping in the daytime under the shelter of thick forest or remote motels that catered more to truckers and drifters than inquisitive tourists. The more distance they placed between themselves and the city, the more acute the sense of relief, yet also the deeper their awareness that they could never turn back. Sometimes they glimpsed the lights of small towns in the valley below, the friendly glow of porch lamps or the flicker of a diner sign, but the risk of recognition or confrontation kept them away. They dined on roadside snacks, scavenged from deserted rest stops, or reheated canned goods purchased hastily from 24-hour convenience stores. After several days of weaving along minor highways and unmarked roads, Colorado's legendary peaks rose ahead, their silhouettes harsh and majestic against the evening sky. The terrain shifted from rolling farmland to rugged inclines dotted with aspen and fir trees. The temperature dropped, crisp air seeping through the car windows, invigorating them despite their exhaustion. The unpaved roads tested the sedan's resilience, rattling its frame as they climbed through a mountain pass. Eventually, they stopped near a clifftop, where they could gaze across a valley illuminated only by stars and the pale glow of a waning moon. Far below, a silver ribbon of river meandered between the dark folds of the earth. They found shelter in an abandoned cabin discovered by pure chance off a narrow dirt track. Its wooden walls bore deep scratches from wind and time, and the roof had missing shingles that let starlight in. Yet it offered a measure of isolation and a place to breathe. By flashlight, they swept away cobwebs and debris, rolling out a pair of old blankets they'd salvaged from a thrift store along the way. The cabin smelled of dust and pine sap, but it was an oasis compared to the tension that had defined their flight so far. In the hush of that first mountain night, they listened to the wind sigh through the pines, a sound as ancient as the peaks themselves. No sirens, no passing headlights, only the rustle of creatures in the underbrush and the distant call of an owl. They whispered promises to each other that they would keep moving, forging a path to a life far removed from the watchful eyes of a society that branded them traitors. The next morning, they rose with the sun cresting over the jagged ridges. The crisp, thin air tasted almost sweet after the stale tension of highways and alleys. Sally ventured to a nearby creek, following the slope until she heard the gurgle of water against rocks. She cupped her hands, letting the icy stream run across her palms. Despite the numbness, it felt purifying. Larry joined her, kneeling beside the current, marveling at how the sunlight sparkled across each eddy. For a moment, they let themselves forget the chase, the accusations, the haunted glances over their shoulders. Here, the swirl of water and sky offered a fragile sense of rebirth. They didn't linger long. With each hour that passed, they risked being tracked. Rumors spoke of a newly empowered movement swarming the cities and highways, branding people like Larry and Sally as enemies of the common good. Billboards in rural areas occasionally displayed cryptic slogans about stamping out traitors. Gas station chatter was tinged with hostility, travelers muttering about folks who undermined societal unity. More than once, they overheard half-whispered conversations about increased border checks. So they pressed on, forging deeper into wilderness or cutting through minor roads that soared across state lines almost unnoticed. Wyoming's endless plains greeted them next, rolling out a windswept tapestry under a sky that felt impossibly wide. They traveled mostly at night to avoid prying eyes, the car's headlights carving a ghostly path across fields of sagebrush. By day, they hid in canyons or behind outcroppings, their vehicle camouflaged beneath tarps and branches. They learned to navigate by old paper maps and the position of the sun, carefully rationing their limited supply of fuel. Once or twice, they risked a truck stop on a remote interstate exit, leaving money on the counter and scurrying away with the essentials. Each transaction felt like an act of subterfuge, a delicate dance of avoidance. Montana's wild rivers and sweeping valleys came next, bridging snow-capped ranges that glowed under moonlit nights. They found another abandoned structure, this time a rickety barn near a stream. The boards were half-eaten by termites, the door barely functional, but it provided a short reprieve. Larry set up a rudimentary fishing line in the nearby water, hoping to catch something fresh for dinner. They improvised a grill from scrap metal, cooking fish over a small fire, the smoky aroma mingling with the night air. It was meager, but it tasted like freedom. Each simple act, catching a meal, boiling water for tea, reinforced their growing conviction that they could survive on the fringes. They discovered solace in small rituals. Sally scribbled daily notes on scraps of paper about the places they saw, the wildlife encountered, the color of the sky at sunset. Larry carved notches into the barn's doorframe to mark the passing of days, a quiet rebellion against the swirl of time that threatened to carry them away. In these stolen intervals, they pieced together a sense of peace that might have seemed unthinkable back in the hustle of the city. The bond between them strengthened, forged by the adversity of constant flight and the shared vow to remain free. Still, the chase was never truly far behind. The newly empowered movement's rumors stretched wide, with talk of patrols scanning highways for subversives. They'd passed certain towns where the local convenience store displays hammered out slogans about law and order, featuring images of what looked suspiciously like manhunts. One night, they noticed a battered flyer at a roadside diner, pinned by the entrance, offering a cash reward for turning in enemies who fled justice. Their hearts pounded as they realized how precarious their position was. The next morning, they packed up with renewed urgency, continuing deeper into isolation, refusing to leave any clue of their route behind. Crossing into Nevada, they encountered deserts that stretched like alien landscapes under the scorching sun. They had to plan carefully for water, refilling containers from any stream or well they found. Occasionally they'd cross ghost towns, clusters of collapsed huts and rusted signage left over from some gold rush era. A strange hush dwelled in these abandoned outposts, the wind whistling through broken windows. They paused only long enough to salvage any leftover supplies or scavenge spare parts for the sedan. Gradually, they honed the skill of living off-grid, foraging, filtering water through rudimentary contraptions, patching up clothing with scraps of cloth found in deserted homesteads. In all their wanderings, they encountered only a handful of people. Most gave them curious or guarded looks but said little. Others seemed equally disenchanted with the state of civilization, offering a grunt of acknowledgement before returning to their own solitary existences. The sense of mutual caution was palpable, as though each drifter recognized that trust was a luxury none could afford. Sometimes, in the hush of a midday rest, Larry and Sally would whisper about what might happen if they were ever recognized. But the constant horizon of open land called them onward, beckoning them to keep going until they found a place so remote that no one would come searching. Weeks blurred together. Their progress was slower now that they avoided any trace of major roads. The sedan, battered from countless miles of unpaved trails, still chugged along. Larry checked its fluids meticulously, patching leaks with duct tape and hope. The seat cushions were stained with dust and sweat, the trunk crammed with random tins of food, jerry cans of water, and a small trove of scavenged spare parts. They rarely had the luxury of stable nights, but each day they discovered a new brand of resilience within themselves. Somewhere along the edge of a high desert plateau, they felt a shift, like they had slipped beyond the last ragged edges of civilization. In that sparse, sun-baked terrain, they found a foothill that rose to a modest peak, offering an expansive view of the surrounding valleys. For hours, they hiked to the summit, the wind whipping dust across their boots. When they reached the top, panting, the landscape unfurled in every direction. Mountains in the distance, desert basins shimmering in the midday heat, a scatter of scrub trees clinging to life in the crevices. The hush was profound, broken only by the hiss of the wind carving across the stones. That night, they made camp near the peak. They lit a small fire from dried brush and listened to the coyotes yip far below. Stars glistened overhead in a display more lavish than any neon city glow. The constellations seemed to watch over them like ancient guardians. It struck both Larry and Sally that despite all the turmoil behind them, here, in this wilderness, they felt an odd sense of belonging. Nature neither condemned them nor demanded explanation. The desert was impartial, welcoming them as it would any other traveler hardy enough to endure its extremes. Rationing the last of their food, they decided the time had come to shift from constant motion to a more stable form of hiding. In a small canyon, they discovered a cluster of boulders that formed a natural enclosure, sheltered from the worst of the winds. Over several days, they transformed that craggy nook into a modest campsite. Sally constructed a lean-to using found branches and a tarp. Larry gathered stones to form a makeshift fire pit, ringed by piles of tinder and brush. They carried water from a distant creek, filtering it with a device jerry-rigged from plastic bottles and porous cloth. Slowly, they carved out a life that, while rudimentary, offered a level of independence and calm they'd scarcely imagined possible. With each passing sunrise, the memory of the city and its persecutors receded a bit further. They still had nightmares of being discovered, but they also awakened each morning to the chorus of distant birds and the rustle of desert hares among the shrubs. Through trial and error, they learned to identify edible desert plants, to set traps for small game, and to read the shifting skies for signs of incoming storms. The daily routines of survival drew them closer together, forging a bond tempered by necessity and fueled by shared hope. Occasionally, they debated whether to continue roaming. The newly empowered movement that branded them traitors might eventually fan out into these remote reaches. But as the weeks melted into months, no sign of pursuit arrived. Perhaps the world had bigger fish to fry, or perhaps the search for two fugitives had lost steam. Regardless, Larry and Sally found themselves increasingly immersed in the raw beauty of their new environment. They constructed a larger shelter from driftwood, collected from a dry riverbed, reinforcing it with clay from the desert floor. They built a small solar still to gather water from the scorching midday air, an invention gleaned from a tattered survival manual they'd salvaged. Nights under the open sky were mesmerizing. They'd take turns keeping watch, perched on a rock overlooking the canyon, scanning for headlights on the distant roads. Though they were far from content in the conventional sense, they discovered a peculiar peace in the knowledge that every inch of their survival was earned through their own hands. Freed from the crush of city lights and the labyrinth of manipulated perceptions, they felt closer to a truth they couldn't fully articulate. The desert, in turn, revealed its secrets. Hidden springs that bubbled unexpectedly from rock walls, clusters of prickly pear cacti that bore sweet fruit if handled with care, pockets of cooler air in canyons where shade lingered. They found an old orchard near a dried-up settlement, its trees twisted and stunted, yet still bearing a few stunted apples. The taste of fresh fruit felt like a miracle. Yet for all this newfound harmony, a sense of longing sometimes gnawed at them, memories of simpler times before they'd been forced into exile. On rare evenings, Larry would stare at the horizon and wonder what had become of the swirling controversies that once engulfed them. Sally occasionally dreamt of warm cafes or comfortable beds, but when they compared those fleeting comforts to the risk of returning, the notion of city life felt suffocating. They remembered the weight of constant judgment, the tightening noose of suspicion. Here, at least, the desert demanded only perseverance, not compliance with a twisted order. Seasons shifted. The desert's scorching days gave way to cooler winds, then a brief but chilling winter that coated the high plateaus with a dusting of snow. Larry and Sally bundled themselves in layers of patched clothing, huddling around a crackling fire that sputtered under the relentless gusts. Despite the hardship, they clung to the reassurance that no pursuing force could endure these conditions more easily than they. Their determination had become a fortress, each day's survival fueling the next. Eventually, as spring teased the landscape with softer breezes, they decided to move again, this time with a sense of serene finality. Packing their gear into the battered sedan that had miraculously survived their desert sojourn, they ventured onto a series of dirt roads that climbed toward a range of rugged cliffs. The route was harrowing, fraught with hairpin turns and sheer drops. But the intuition that this was their ultimate frontier guided them onward. Late one afternoon, they found a narrow crest that overlooked a canyon vast enough to seem like another planet. Their engine sputtered as Larry coaxed the car into a small clearing, which ended abruptly at a cliff's edge. Sally stepped out first, a gust of wind whipping her hair around her face. Larry joined her, the two standing shoulder to shoulder, their hearts thrumming in unison. Before them, the horizon glowed with the final colors of daylight, a tapestry of purples and oranges that bled into the clouds. Far below, a snaking river glinted like liquid silver. They pitched a simple camp near the cliff, cooking their last can of beans over a modest fire. In the distance, a thunderhead rumbled, but the storm veered away, leaving them with a sky full of stars as dusk descended. They sat in silence, leaning against each other, the crackle of flames weaving into the nocturnal hush. This was perhaps the quietest night they had ever known. No sound of distant cars, no hum of electricity, just the faint whisper of the wind curling around rocks. By the time dawn arrived, its pale glow banishing the stars one by one, they both stirred, feeling the day's significance in their bones. Sally stood at the cliff's edge, arms folded against the chilly breeze, eyes scanning the endless panorama that unfolded under the dawn sky. Larry joined her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. The crisp morning air felt cleansing, each breath a reminder that they had chosen freedom on their own terms, even if it meant a permanent exile from the familiar world. They exchanged a glance, charged with a mix of gratitude and longing. Neither had words for what they were experiencing, and perhaps none were needed. In that sweeping frontier, with craggy peaks thrusting skyward and broad valleys rolling into the distance, they found a potent affirmation. They had not surrendered. They had simply left behind a place that no longer offered them a shred of hope. As the sun inched above the jagged horizon, it bathed the canyon in a golden radiance so pure it made them momentarily forget every trial behind them. The wind picked up, carrying a faint echo of bird calls and rustling sage. They inhaled deeply, tasting the freedom in the air, an essence uncorrupted by blame or scrutiny. No eyes watched them here, no laws twisted to punish the innocent, no judgments waiting to strike. For a long while, they stood in reverent stillness, letting the newly risen sun warm their faces. The sky shifted from gold to a clear blue, unveiling more detail of the wilderness stretching as far as they could see. It felt like a blessing bestowed by the land itself, a promise that despite what they had lost, something vast and untamed could still cradle them without condemnation. The final vestiges of their old life loosened their grip, drifting into memory. Eventually, Larry turned to Sally, the corners of his mouth lifting in a subdued but genuine smile. "We can make a life out here," he said softly, voice trembling with conviction. She smiled back, nodding through tears that glistened with both sadness and a fierce joy. Together, they retreated from the cliff to stoke the small fire for warmth, preparing for the new day like pioneers forging a path in an untouched land. No matter what came next, they would face it side by side, bound by their shared trauma and an unwavering vow never to return to the madness they had left behind. Each step from now on would echo with the promise of the frontier, a wild domain unburdened by the shackles of a society that had cast them out. Their footprints in the dusty earth would fade with the wind, leaving no trace for pursuers. And if that newly empowered movement ever ventured this far, they would find only the ghosts of two determined souls, who had learned to cherish the hush of open skies more than any false security the old world could offer. In that final moment, as the sun rose high enough to chase the remaining shadows off the cliffside, Larry and Sally stood arm in arm, gazing at an endless panorama. The raw beauty of the rocks and valleys gleamed under a pristine sky, and the air swirled with a faint mountain fragrance, as if beckoning them to explore further. Despite the hardships that lay behind, and the unknowns ahead, they felt the stirring of a quiet victory. They had chosen each other and the wilderness over fear and subjugation. Here, above the rugged canyon, they took their first deep breaths of absolute freedom, letting the exiled hush wrap them in a promise of undiluted possibility. The world they fled had drifted so far from the values they once trusted that it scarcely felt like home anymore. Empathy had been eclipsed by blame, and justice had become a weapon wielded against the vulnerable rather than a shield for their protection. Cities thrummed with suspicion, and courts punished those who dared speak out. It was as though an entire civilization had twisted itself inside out, forcing Larry and Sally to abandon it for good. Yet on the frontier's edge, amid rugged cliffs and endless skies, they discovered a quieter truth. There, survival depended on cooperation, not condemnation. Life was harsh, but it was honest. Each sunrise offered the chance to begin again in a realm that asked only for grit and respect. Despite the shadows chasing them, Larry and Sally held on to a modest hope that someday, beyond these mountains, the world might awaken from its fever of cruelty, remember its better nature, and welcome all those it once cast aside. Until that day dawns, they continue on in their stolen peace, crafting a life rooted in shared resolve, a life that, for all its trials, remains free from the echo of blame. The end.